Harry Potter has been analyzed to death. Like, if you've ever gone down a YouTube rabbit hole, you already know people have power-scaled Dumbledore, debated wand lore, ranked unforgivable curses, and written entire manifestos about whether Snape is a tragic hero or just a greasy war criminal with tenure. So you might be asking yourself, what's left to say about Voldemort of all people? You've seen him 1,000 times. If you're like me, you probably did the midnight book releases, the movie marathons, the Lego games, maybe even have that one paperback of Half-Blood Prince that's held together by nostalgia and duct tape at this point. You've watched the graveyard scene, the ministry duel, the Battle of Hogwarts so often that Ralph Fiennes's no-nose face is kind of just background noise now. You feel like you already know him inside and out, right? The snake guy, the evil wizard. End of story. But here's the thing. The Voldemort in the movies might actually be the least scary version of him. On purpose, the films had to compress 7 books of psychological horror, war crimes, and soul mutilation into a handful of big set pieces where he mostly screams Harry Potter across a battlefield and does cool wand sparks. An HBO remake, with 10 hours per book and a much darker tone, is sitting on the chance to finally show the monster the text has been quietly describing for years. I mean, come on. The books give you Tom Riddle in a Muggle orphanage, calmly tormenting other kids, stealing trophies, speaking Parseltongue to snakes like it's nothing, and then smiling sweetly at adults so they never suspect a thing. They give you the Gaunt family, inbred descendants of Salazar Slytherin, living in a shack full of domestic abuse and blood purity obsession. They give you Horcruxes that are not just spooky soul jars, but literal acts of spiritual self-dismemberment. The movies gesture at that stuff for, 5 minutes total? So what we're going to do in this video is the darkly cozy version. This is your Fall Asleep 2 deep dive, where instead of relaxing ocean sounds, you get a calm walkthrough of the most unsettling corners of Voldemort lore. We're going to talk about the kind of horror that doesn't need jump scares, the slow erosion of a kid's empathy, the way a whole society learns to live with terror, the body horror of a man who keeps ripping his own soul apart and calling it immortality. And you don't have to take my word for it that the movies barely scratched the surface. In case you've forgotten, the first Wizarding War is mostly backstory on screen, a montage, a few newspaper clippings, some lines about the dark times. HBO has the runtime to show you what it actually means when Death Eaters control the government, when disappearances are normal, when people flinch every time green light flashes outside their window. By the time we've walked through the orphanage, the Gaunt Shack, the ritual of making a Horcrux, and the everyday brutality of that first war, the movie Voldemort might start to feel weirdly tame. So let's meet the version you never really saw. So why on earth are we going to spend, 2 hours talking about one noseless wizard while you're allegedly trying to fall asleep? Because this isn't just Voldemort bad guy, no hugs, lots of murder. This is a full Voldemort iceberg. We're going to start with the stuff you probably remember from the movies. The creepy back-of-the-head reveal, the graveyard resurrection, the awkward hug with Draco, and then we're going to keep going down, past the Tom Riddle flashbacks, into the parts the films either sped past or quietly pretended didn't exist. You might be asking yourself, okay, but what am I actually getting out of that besides nightmares? First, new angles on scenes you already know by heart. We're going to look at things like the orphanage visit, the diary possession, even little moments like him calling Harry, the boy who lived, come to die, and ask, how would a prestige HBO show shoot this if they leaned into psychological horror instead of PG-13 spectacle. Longer takes, quieter sound design, lingering on faces a beat too long, that kind of thing. Then we go deeper, obscure book details, author interviews, and the weird half-canon stuff about soul magic that lives in the margins. In case you've forgotten, creating a Horcrux isn't just do a murder, shout some Latin, get an evil USB stick. It's described as a horrific, painful, reality-warping act that tears the soul apart. HBO could literally show that as body horror and soul horror at the same time. Veins going black, reality bending, maybe the camera itself glitching as his soul splits. If you're like me, you've read these books a bunch of times, but you've never really stopped to map out Tom Riddle's life like a season-by-season TV outline. That's what this video is going to do. We'll talk about how you structure a slow-motion moral collapse across multiple seasons. Orphanage kid with creepy powers, gifted but unsettling Hogwarts student, charming young man visiting old ladies who mysteriously die, and eventually a warlord experimenting on his own soul because death is vulgar. And the Iceberg format lets us escalate without you noticing exactly when it got awful. At the top, it's, haha, he's kind of dramatic. A bit lower, it's manipulation, gaslighting, and grooming his followers. Then we drift into war crimes, the first wizarding war as an actual occupation, disappearances, torture as policy, the way the ministry caves. By the time we hit the bottom layers, we're talking about generational trauma, blood purity ideology, and what it means to permanently damage your own soul and still keep functioning. Tone-wise, I'm going to keep it conversational and a little irreverent, because I mean, come on, you're listening to Dark Wizard War Crimes as a sleep aid. But underneath the jokes, this is built on close reading, weird little continuity knots, and an understanding of how shows like Chernobyl or True Detective pace dread and character arcs. And if you end up liking this format, this mix of cozy voice, horrible lore, and what would HBO do with this speculation, you don't have to take my word for it that Voldemort is the last stop. We can iceberg Dumbledore's morally questionable master plans, Snape's double-triple agent mess, even the Ministry of Magic as a full dystopian bureaucracy. For tonight, though, we start with the Dark Lord, right at the surface, and then we're going to take the first step down. So, since we're going to take that first step down, we should probably talk about the giant frozen meme in the room, the iceberg. And if you don't know how an iceberg works at this point, I don't know where you've been for the last 5 years of internet. But don't worry, I'll be nice and pretend you didn't just crawl out of a digital cave. An iceberg chart is basically a way of saying, here's the stuff everyone knows at the top, and here's the weird, cursed. Why did the author write this at 3 a.m.? Material buried at the bottom. The tip is the Voldemort you remember from the movies, and casual fandom. No nose, big speeches, green laser light shows. That's surface-level Tom. As we go down, each layer is going to get more obscure, more morally gross, or just straight up more horrifying. You might be asking yourself, okay, but what does that actually look like? So imagine the iceberg as stacked levels. Level 1 is movie Voldemort, the orphanage flashback you kind of half remember, the graveyard resurrection, the final duel. Then, a bit lower, we hit book Voldemort, the stuff the films trimmed or softened, like how casually he experiments on his own soul, or how many people quietly disappear during the First Wizarding War. Below that, we get into things like the Gaunt family's inbred decay, blood purity ideology, and what it really means to live in a world where your boss might literally be a Death Eater. Each level isn't just one idea. Every tier will have multiple entries, and each entry is going to follow a little pattern so you don't get lost in the dark. First, what the movies showed you, or didn't show you at all. Then, what the books and extra lore actually say when you slow down and look. And finally, how HBO, with a full season and a TV May rating, could turn that into genuine horror or slow-burn psychological drama. Pattern interrupt for your brain. We're not only talking jump scares and snake faces. We're talking implied war crimes, the metaphysics of soul damage, the mechanics of Horcrux rituals the films politely cut away from, and how close Tom Riddle might have been to just becoming a bitter, petty professor instead of the wizarding world's answer to a fascist cult leader. I mean, come on. Imagine an episode that just sits in his Hogwarts years, watching him practice being charming while you know exactly where it's going. And if you're like me, and you already know way too much trivia, don't click away yet. The point isn't just, hey, remember this obscure line from Half-Blood Prince? It's asking, what happens when you film that line like prestige horror? What ethical messes pop out when you treat wizarding war like an actual war instead of background lightning? By the time we hit the deepest levels, even if you've memorized the wiki, the HBO angle, and the uncomfortable questions about choice, fate, and soul mutilation are still going to give you something new to chew on while you try to sleep. So, with the rules of the iceberg in place, let's start at the very top. The Voldemort you think you know. So, when I say, the Voldemort you think you know, who pops into your head? Probably the snake-faced guy in a black cloak screaming, Avada Kedavra, across a CGI battlefield while the soundtrack does most of the heavy lifting. Movie Voldemort is a vibe, but he's also pretty much a boss fight. He shows up in big set pieces: the graveyard, the ministry, the astronomy tower, the Battle of Hogwarts. He shouts, he monologues, he does the I am very evil laugh, and then he vanishes again so we can get back to Harry's school drama. We get a couple of moody flashbacks in Half-Blood Prince, but they're more like lore cutscenes than an actual character study. In case you've forgotten, the films basically speedrun his life. Orphanage kid, weird teen in a suit. Suddenly, he's a noseless warlord. Blink, and you miss the connective tissue. The scariest thing about him on screen is mostly the jump scare factor, the dream visions, the possession in Order of the Phoenix, the way he just pops out of the back of Quirrell's head like a cursed skin condition. Book Voldemort, though, that's a different monster. On the page, he starts as Tom Riddle, disturbingly charming, meticulously polite, the kind of kid who makes teachers say, he's so gifted, while all the other children quietly develop ulcers. If you're like me, you remember that first orphanage visit with Dumbledore and thinking, oh, this is not a normal 11-year-old. He's already stealing, already hurting other kids, already collecting trophies, and he talks to Dumbledore like a tiny lawyer trying to negotiate out of a murder charge. You might be asking yourself, how is that actually scarier than the horror movie wizard with the snake face? It's because Book Tom doesn't flip a switch. He slides. Every conversation at Hogwarts is this icy, controlled performance. He flatters Slughorn while fishing for information about Horcruxes. He goes back to the Gaunt Shack like he's doing a family history project, then walks out having committed a triple murder and framed his uncle. And he does it all politely, calmly. No shouting, no lightning, just one careful boundary pushed after another. The real difference is runtime. The movies have, what, a handful of scenes to sketch his entire arc? An HBO series could spend entire episodes just sitting with each phase: the orphanage years, early Hogwarts, the prefect everyone admires, the summer he kills his father, the first generation of Death Eaters. We're going to watch him choose, over and over, to be slightly worse than yesterday, until Lord Voldemort feels less like a costume and more like the only logical endpoint. And horror isn't just jump scares and loud music. It's watching someone you could almost understand make one small, awful choice after another until they're unrecognizable. You don't have to take my word for it. Serialized TV has been doing slow-motion moral collapse for years. Imagine that, but with soul magic. By the time we actually get to green flashes of Avada Kedavra, the murders might feel like the least disturbing part. Because once we walk through his childhood and those early Hogwarts years in detail, the really scary stuff isn't that he kills people. It's what he has to carve out of himself first. And to see how deep that carving goes, we have to start at the beginning. The boy in the orphanage and the cursed family he never met. The boy in the orphanage is where it stops feeling like fantasy and starts feeling like a true crime podcast you accidentally left playing at 2 a.m. In case you've forgotten, canon gives us way more here than the movies bothered to use. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore visits this grim London orphanage during the war, and Tom is already wrong. He's polite to adults, clipped, controlled. Yes, sir. No, sir. But the staff are quietly terrified of him. Other kids get hurt around him. Things go missing. He steals from them and keeps little trophies, like he's rehearsing for serial killer bingo. And every time someone tries to press him on it, he just stares them down with that cold, flat certainty that he is not the problem. The film gives you, what, 2 minutes of that? A gray room? A sulky kid? And then, boom, Hogwarts letter. HBO, though, is going to have time to live in this place. You might be asking yourself, how do you make an orphanage scary without just being mean? Easy. Shoot it like a bleak period thriller. Cold, washed-out lighting, damp walls, echoing hallways where footsteps sound just a little too close behind you, even when Tom is supposedly alone. We're going to see subtle supernatural stuff no one can explain. A bully wakes up with his bed surrounded by dead insects, all arranged in a neat circle. A door that's always stuck suddenly slams on a child's hand the second they reach for Tom's toy. The matron's favorite teacup slowly sliding toward the edge of the table whenever she talks about sending him away. Nothing big, nothing flashy, just the universe bending around the one kid who refuses to be powerless. And then you expand the scenes we only hear about in passing. The infamous cave trip? The book tells us Tom led 2 kids to a seaside cave, and they came back wordless and traumatized. HBO can take an entire act for that. Long walk along the cliffs, Tom perfectly charming, the other children laughing, and then the cave interior turning into a nightmare of darkness, distant whispers, maybe the water itself reacting to his presence. We don't even have to see what he does. We just need to see the before and after. When Dumbledore confronts him, Tom casually admits he can make animals do what he wants, make people hurt, make them pay. No remorse, no fear he's in trouble, just irritation at being questioned. And that's where the psychological horror really lands. The scariest part isn't that he has powers. It's that, if you're like me, you notice he instinctively uses them to control and humiliate. No one taught him dark arts. This is just what he does when you hand him the smallest amount of advantage. I mean, come on. If you stripped the wands and house names out of this and aired it as an HBO pilot about a gifted but cruel orphan, would you even clock this as Harry Potter yet? Or would you think you'd stumbled into some grounded horror drama about a future cult leader? And the worst part is, we haven't even gotten to the moment someone finally tells him he's special on purpose. So when Dumbledore finally walks into that orphanage, this should not feel like a quirky recruitment scene. This is the moment the horror movie opens its eyes. In case you've forgotten, Book Dumbledore doesn't find a wide-eyed, grateful kid. He finds Tom sitting apart from the others, already suspicious, already coiled. Riddle's first instinct is not wonder, it's threat assessment. Who are you? How did you find me? What do you want? And when Dumbledore says, "Hey, you're a wizard," Tom basically goes, "Prove it." I mean, come on. What 11-year-old demands empirical evidence before accepting their Hogwarts letter? He's not starstruck. He's interrogating the universe. HBO could really linger on that. The camera tight on his face, the way his eyes don't soften when the word magic drops. They sharpen. In the book, he shows Dumbledore the cupboard with his stolen trophies from the other children. The film turns this into a quick, slightly spooky info dump, like, ah yes, here is some backstory, moving on. An HBO version could treat that cupboard like a crime scene. Objects shifting on their own when Tom gets angry, distant voices echoing in the hall. Maybe the matron's footsteps stop outside the door because she's afraid to come in. You might be asking yourself, isn't that a bit much for a kid? Yeah, that's the point. And then you get Tom's reaction when he realizes magic is real and he has it. It's not relief, it's triumph. He says he always knew he was different, that he could make things happen, hurt people who hurt him. He's already framed his life as predator versus prey. When he says Hogwarts will be better because he won't have to come back to the orphanage, you can hear the subtext, rules don't apply to me anymore. If you're like me, that line reads way darker on a reread than it did when you were 12. This is where the ethical horror creeps in. Dumbledore absolutely clocks that something is wrong. He sees the trophies, hears the casual way Tom talks about cruelty, watches him test boundaries in real time. And what does he do? He gives him a wand shopping voucher and leaves him in the system for another month. We're going to talk a lot about Voldemort's choices, but HBO could really twist the knife on the adults who looked at this obviously volatile child and said, we'll keep an eye on him. Quick pattern interrupt. Imagine this exact scene, but Dumbledore is a social worker, Tom is a kid with a knife collection, and the word magic never comes up. Suddenly, it's not whimsical at all. It's a mandatory report. And once Tom gets to Hogwarts, that's when it actually gets worse, not better. Because now he has teachers to charm, peers to manipulate, a castle full of secrets to weaponize. No glowing green skulls yet, no flashy wand duels, just a boy who learns that if he smiles the right way, everyone will hand him exactly the power he's been craving. Level 2 is where it gets creepy in a different way. Because on paper, this is the safest version of Tom you're ever going to see. Polished robes, perfect marks, prefect badge shining. This is the era where he looks the least like Voldemort, and is already making the choices that lock him into becoming the Dark Lord. In case you've forgotten, the books really lean into how beloved he is. Slughorn collects him like a rare trading card. Dippet worries about his feelings. Other students admire him, trail after him, probably copy his homework. By the time he's head boy, Tom Riddle is basically Hogwarts' golden child, and the wild part is that almost nobody notices he's simultaneously hoarding information about dark magic, experimenting on other kids emotionally, and treating the castle like his personal laboratory. You might be asking yourself, how do you make popular student actually scary on screen? This is where HBO's format is kind of perfect. Imagine multiple seasons where, by day, Tom is this handsome, brilliant problem solver. He's helping first years find their way. He's charming the staff. He's the one who just happens to be nearby when some minor school mystery needs solving. And then, cut to night, and he's in the restricted section, reading about soul magic by candlelight, practicing legilimency on sleeping roommates, and quietly testing how far he can push people before they break. We're going to watch him solve mysteries he secretly caused. That's the horror. He comforts the victims of strange accidents he engineered. He reports worrying behavior that he planted. It starts to feel less like a school story and more like a prestige drama about a secret serial killer who also gets straight O's in his NEWTs. If you're like me, the scariest part isn't the wand work, it's the social camouflage. The idea that the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone trusts, the one the headmaster writes glowing references for. HBO can sit with that. The lingering shots of teachers praising him, the slow realization that Dumbledore is the only one getting that uncanny valley vibe off this perfect student, and even he can't prove anything yet. And you don't have to take my word for it. The books already give us the beats. Young Tom tracking down the Gaunt Shack on a school holiday, politely asking about family history while mentally cataloging heirlooms. Tom visiting the orphanage director years later, smiling as he rewrites his own childhood. Those scenes are practically storyboards for an HBO creep fest. We're still only at level 2, but you can already seed the next horrors. The Chamber of Secrets doesn't just open one afternoon. HBO can show the build-up. Tom piecing together Parseltongue, stalking plumbing schematics, treating a 1,000-year-old basilisk like his secret science project. Parallel to that, we get the summer where he visits Little Hangleton, murders his father and grandparents with clinical detachment, and walks away without a scratch on his reputation. And somewhere in those late-night library visits, he stumbles on the word Horcrux for the first time. He doesn't make one yet, but you see the idea land. You see the tiny, satisfied smile. That's the moment the charming monster stops pretending he's human at all, which is exactly where we're heading next. And once that tiny smile lands, we're going to watch him test drive it on an entire school. Because in case you've forgotten, Tom doesn't go from slightly smug prefect to snake-faced war criminal overnight. His first big experiment in large-scale horror is the Chamber of Secrets. In canon, it's actually pretty straightforward. He figures out he's Slytherin's heir, tracks down the entrance, opens the chamber, and starts weaponizing a basilisk like it's his own personal school-wide curse. Students get petrified, Myrtle dies, and Hagrid takes the fall while Tom walks away with a shiny award for special services to the school. The movies compress all of that into one dreamy little sepia-toned diary flashback. It's like, hey Harry, here's my villain origin story in 5 minutes. Also enjoy the Instagram filter. HBO doesn't have to do that. HBO can stretch this into an entire season that plays like a slow-burn horror mystery. Week after week, you're at Hogwarts with these kids who don't know they're inside Tom's science experiment. You might be asking yourself, what does that actually look like? Picture this. Strange incidents start small. A student swears they heard someone whispering in the walls, but nobody else heard it. Water keeps pooling in random corridors, dripping from ceilings that aren't leaking. Cats hiss at empty air. People start avoiding certain staircases after dark, not because of peeves, but because they feel watched. And right in the middle of all that? Tom Riddle, head boy, model student, the boy every professor trusts. He's helping Dippet organize patrols, walking first years back to their dorms, offering to assist the staff with interviews. If you're like me, you can already see the incredibly smug study schedules. He's literally investigating his own crimes, asking all the right questions, gently steering suspicion toward dangerous creatures, and that odd boy with the monster in his pocket. Each episode could dial up specific horror beats. A kid hears the basilisk's voice in the pipes while brushing their teeth. Another wakes up to find their dorm floor soaked, the water seeping under the door from moaning Myrtle's bathroom. We cut between students nervously joking about a Hogwarts ghost story, and Tom quietly slipping away to whisper Parseltongue into a sink. You don't have to take my word for it. The book already gives you the bones. HBO just gets to linger. And Myrtle's death? I mean, come on. The movies treat her like comic relief. Here, she's a lonely, bullied girl we've spent episodes with. We've seen her get mocked for her glasses, cry in that bathroom, clutch her books too tight. When Tom sends the basilisk to kill her, it's not a random casualty. It's a calculated choice. Her murder is just a necessary sacrifice, a convenient corpse to anchor future magic. He walks past her body thinking about logistics. That's the real horror. This is Tom's first taste of controlling an entire community through fear. He learns how people react, how rumors move, how authority can be nudged and redirected. Hogwarts becomes his test lab. And the really fun part is what he decides to do once he realizes the experiment worked, which is where things start getting much, much bigger. So where do you go after you've successfully run a fear experiment on an entire school? If you're like me, you grab a snack and rewatch Prisoner of Azkaban. If you're Tom Riddle, you go home for the holidays and commit your first war crime. We have to talk about the Gaunt Shack. In case you've forgotten, this is one of the bleakest locations in the series, a collapsing little house in the middle of nowhere, full of inbred Slytherin descendants and generational violence. HBO could really lean into that gothic rot. Young Tom walks in, thinking he's about to discover some glorious pure-blood legacy, and instead he gets Marvolo shouting, Morphin hissing in parcel tongue, and the story that his muggle father abandoned his pregnant witch mother. You might be asking yourself, how do you make Voldemort scarier than he already is? You show the exact moment he decides that hurt is going to be policy. The books make it clear he leaves that shack with a plan. He's not storming out in a teenage rage. He's cold, focused, already rewriting the story in his head. His father didn't just leave his mother. In Tom's mind, Muggles betrayed him, rejected magic, rejected him. And instead of ever unpacking the Gaunt's abuse or his mother's choices, he decides to erase the entire Muggle side of his family tree. Literally. The films barely touch this. We get a couple of moody flashbacks, and that's it. But this is one of the most important psychological beats in his whole arc, because it's the moment he chooses to blame an entire species rather than look at his own deeply cursed family. So picture an HBO episode where we're going to follow Tom leaving Hogwarts for a holiday. He's charming, polite, suitcase in hand, teachers probably wishing more boys were like Riddle. Cut to Little Hangleton, sleepy village, gossiping neighbors, that one pub where everyone knows everyone's business. Tom walks in, turns on the orphan boy smile, asks a few innocent questions about the riddles up at the big house. No dramatic music, no neon green lighting, just this unnervingly normal social interaction. I mean, come on, that's already creepier than a skull in the sky. Then we see him at the Riddle House. HBO doesn't need flashy duels. It can play it almost clinically. A closed door, a teacup cooling on a table, maybe a single quiet spell, and the camera stays in the hallway while 3 thuds hit the floor off-screen. You don't have to take my word for it, but implied violence is often way worse than watching it. Pattern interrupt. Cut away from magic entirely. Show the aftermath. Villagers crowding the gate, the coroner baffled by 3 bodies with no marks, the police interviews going nowhere, people whispering that Morphin Gaunt always was a nasty piece of work, so sure, he probably did it. And we know Tom framed him, stole his ring, and walked away clean, completely fine, sacrificing a relative to protect his new, carefully edited identity. And under all of that, HBO can start threading in the soul horror. This is almost certainly where he makes his first Horcrux. Imagine intercutting the domestic crime scene with brief, fragmented shots of something ritualistic in a forest or a ruined chapel. Blood on stone, Tom's face lit by sickly candlelight, a scream that cuts off mid-echo. We don't see the full spell yet. We just feel that something in him has been permanently torn. That's the moment he stops being a boy who kills and starts being something not quite human anymore. And the terrifying part? This is only murder number 1 on the road to the first Wizarding War. And if that first murder felt like the moment Tom stopped being human, level 3 is where we find out he never really had a chance. Because now we're going to stop watching Tom in isolation and start looking at the cursed soil he grew out of, the Gaunt family. If you're like me, you might be asking yourself, how do you make Voldemort scarier than Snake Fascist who lives under your skull? You go home with him, not to the orphanage, but further back, to the people who treated Salazar Slytherin's bloodline like a religion and their actual house like a trash can. The Gaunts are what happens when pure blood ideology sits in a damp cellar for a few centuries and grows mold. In case you've forgotten, the Gaunt Shack chapter in Half-Blood Prince is already straight horror. Harry and Dumbledore show up at this crumbling cottage in Little Hangleton, roof half gone, yard a tangle of weeds and nettles, snakes literally living in the walls. Inside, Marvolo Gaunt is screaming at his daughter Merope, throwing knives, smashing stuff, and proudly waving around Slytherin's locket and ring like they're worth more than food. They live in filth, they're clearly inbred, and yet they act like royalty because we're descended from Slytherin, actually. I mean, come on. It's delusional cosplay with domestic violence. Now picture that with HBO money. The shack isn't just a bit messy, it's full gothic rot. The door hangs crooked, the yard is overgrown to the point it's basically trying to swallow the house, and the interior is this claustrophobic cave of peeling wallpaper, damp stains, and too many shadows. Every time Marvolo or Morphin steps into frame, the sound design tightens, boots on broken glass, breath too loud, a knife clinking against a bottle. You don't have to take my word for it. The text already treats these scenes like a haunted house tour. The show just has to lean in. And then you layer in the ideology. These people worship pure blood, but they're living in near ruin, wearing rags, and abusing the only woman in the house for daring to look at a muggle. Voldemort inherits that worldview, the obsession with lineage, the contempt for anyone lesser, and the total inability to see his own life as anything but destiny. But he's also the product of a loveless, coerced relationship between witch and muggle, a romance literally built on a potion that wears off. So what does that do to a kid who already feels different? It turns bigotry into family tradition and self-loathing into a mission statement. HBO can make that feel inevitable, not abstract. Spend real time with Merope's silence, Tom Riddle Sr.'s horror when the spell breaks, and the way the village talks about those Gaunts up the lane, like a local curse. By the time baby Tom is left at the orphanage gate, you're not just seeing a future Dark Lord. You're seeing generations of violence, obsession, and rot concentrating into one person. And you know, this story isn't getting happier from here. And here's where HBO can get really nasty with it. Because blood purity in the books isn't just wizards being racist. It's a full-on, quasi-religious death cult that just happens to be socially acceptable at dinner parties. The Gaunts don't just believe they're better. They're willing to literally rot in that shack rather than admit the system that made them special has also made them miserable. If you're like me, you read that chapter and go, oh, this isn't politics. This is theology with knives. You might be asking yourself, Didn't the movies already cover this? Kind of. But on screen it mostly turns into generic wizard racism. Malfoy sneers, someone says, "Mudblood." We move on. An HBO series could slow down and show you the rituals that make this stuff feel holy. Imagine candlelit dinners where Marvolo makes his kids recite the family tree like scripture, tracing back to Salazar Slytherin, pausing for every proper marriage like he's reading from a sacred text. We're going to see symbols everywhere. The locket and the ring aren't just cool props, they're relics. HBO could frame them like haunted objects in a ghost story. In case you've forgotten, Marvolo literally attacks a ministry official for touching the locket. Picture that scene shot like a possession. The moment his fingers brush the chain, Marvolo's whole demeanor changes, voice dropping, eyes wild, as if the heirloom itself is speaking through him. Now contrast that with young Merope. Same pure blood, same sacred house, and she's treated as garbage. You get Marvolo ranting about Slytherin's line 1 second and calling his own daughter a squib the next, like the belief system eats its own. HBO could sit in those moments where she's forced to polish the ring she's not allowed to wear, clean the locket she'll never inherit, being told she's unworthy of the very purity they worship. I mean, come on, that's not just abuse, that's indoctrination weaponized as domestic horror. And once you've seen that private madness, Voldemort's later movement suddenly looks like the logical endpoint. The Death Eaters are just the Gaunt theology with better tailoring and more skull imagery. You don't have to take my word for it. The books already frame them like a cult. Masks, secret meetings, branded bodies. HBO could lean into real-world extremist parallels here. Recruitment scenes, late-night whisper sessions in drawing rooms, kids being praised for hexing undesirables, the way other families praise good grades. All of that sets up something even darker. Those holy heirlooms are going to become Horcruxes. The ring, the locket, the objects that carried his family's ideology are literally going to carry pieces of his soul. Ideological horror fuses with supernatural horror, and once you see how he gets there, you're probably not going to look at any magical artifact in this world the same way again. Because the way you make a Horcrux on HBO? That's where this cult finally shows you its true ritual. And speaking of rituals, we need to talk about the first one Voldemort ever participated in, before he was even born. Because if you're like me, you grew up with this kind of vague idea that Voldemort just, appeared as a bad egg at the orphanage. Evil baby, evil child, evil teen, done. But the books quietly give you something way darker, a love story that isn't actually a love story at all. It's a crime scene. In case you've forgotten, Merope Gaunt is Tom Riddle's mother. She grows up in that collapsing shack with an abusive father and brother who literally use magic to keep her powerless. They terrorize her. They mock her. They treat her like a servant in a house that already looks like it wants to die. She's a witch who's been bullied so hard her magic barely works. That's the level of psychological damage we're starting from. And then she sees Tom Riddle Sr. riding past. The handsome muggle boy on the horse. The one bright, shiny thing in her entire swamp of a life. You might be asking yourself, why doesn't she just talk to him? Because she has no model for normal human relationships. The only power she's ever seen used is coercive. So when she reaches for magic, she reaches for what she knows. A love potion. Movies blow past this in, 2 lines. HBO is going to slow it down. They can give Merope an entire tragic mini-arc. The stolen glances at the window, the clumsy attempts at wand work when her father's gone, the moment she finally brews that potion. We're going to watch her hands shake as she offers Tom a drink at the pub. See the way his eyes glaze just slightly, the way his smile turns a little too perfect. It's going to look like a romance montage and feel completely wrong. Pattern interrupt. This is not cute. This is magical assault. A relationship built on a potion is not a relationship. It's a kidnapping with better lighting. For a while, Merope gets what she thinks she wanted. A marriage, a home, maybe even laughter at the dinner table. HBO can make that brief period almost warm, almost sitcom normal, and that's what makes the drop so brutal. Because the second she stops dosing him, hoping, desperately, that he'll love her for real. Tom Riddle Sr. snaps out of it, takes one horrified look at his life, and walks out on his pregnant wife without a backward glance. That's the ethical horror sitting at the root of Voldemort's origin. A child conceived under magical coercion in a house built on lies, abandonment, and generational abuse. Some fans like to say his inability to love comes from being a potion baby. Whether or not the magic literally rewired him, the symbolism is nasty. His very existence is tangled up with violation and rejection. And HBO can lean into that without turning Merope into a cartoon villain. If they show her sympathetically, shaking, traumatized, doing something unforgivable because it's the only tool she's ever seen, Voldemort gets scarier, not softer. His hatred of his Muggle father stops being generic blood purity rage and starts looking like this warped echo of a family story he refuses to face. He despises his father, erases his mother, and reinvents himself as Lord Voldemort to outrun the fact that he's the byproduct of everybody failing everybody. You don't have to take my word for it. Imagine an HBO episode that ends with Merope alone in London, clutching her stomach, selling Slytherin's locket just to survive. Cut from that to Tom in the orphanage, coolly stealing from the other kids, insisting he's special. Suddenly, his evil isn't this random plot device. It's the logical, horrible continuation of choices and abuses that started long before he could walk. And once you feel that weight, every time he kills someone later, you're not just watching a Dark Lord. You're watching the end point of a curse that was never about a spell. Which raises a really uncomfortable question. If this is where he starts, what does it look like when he finally decides to break his own soul on purpose? That's the moment we drop into level 4 of the iceberg. Up here, Voldemort isn't just a bad guy with a tragic backstory anymore. This is where he starts literally breaking the rules of being a person. He looks at the basic deal every human gets: one body, one soul, one life, and goes, what if I just tear that up? You might be asking yourself, isn't that just what a Horcrux is? We all know this. Keep it moving. But the books quietly treat Horcruxes like the magical equivalent of nuclear waste mixed with a snuff film. Everyone knows they exist. Nobody wants to talk about the details. In case you've forgotten, even Slughorn, who will happily brag about illegally brewing love potions for teenagers, practically has a panic attack when Tom brings up Horcruxes. The text is very clear on two things. 1, you have to commit murder, and 2, you have to do something else that is so taboo, so spiritually disgusting, that even dark wizards kind of back away, like, yeah, no, that's where I draw the line. Rowling deliberately keeps the ritual vague, which is honestly scarier than a step-by-step recipe. Your brain starts filling in the gaps with stuff way worse than anything she could print in a kid's book. The movies? I mean, come on. They pretty much treat Horcruxes like evil USB drives. They glow. They whisper a bit. You stab them with a sword. Roll credits. We never see one being made. We never watch Tom cross that line the first time, or the second, or the 7th. We don't see what it does to him to keep tearing off pieces of himself like he's peeling skin. If you're like me, that always felt like a giant missed opportunity, because the whole point is that he doesn't just look less human over time. He is less human. An HBO series has the runtime to lean into that. Imagine each Horcrux creation as its own mini horror film, intercut with Tom's body and mind, glitching a little more every time. The diary tied to Myrtle's death. Cramped bathroom, flickering lights. Tom calmly watching her die and then performing a ritual that makes the air warp, while his reflection in the mirror lags half a second behind. The ring in the Gaunt Shack, blood on the walls, ancestral voices, his features stretching just a bit too long as he seals another shard away. You don't have to take my word for it. The books literally say his face and body change as his soul is mutilated. HBO can show that as progressive body horror, eyes losing focus, skin going waxy, movements getting snake-jerky. By the time we reach the last Horcrux, you're not really looking at Tom Riddle anymore. You're looking at something wearing his memories like a costume, and the line between Dark Lord and inhuman thing that shouldn't exist is going to feel disturbingly thin. And once you've watched him break himself on purpose 7 times, we can finally talk about what kind of war that creature actually wages. So let's zoom in on the worst night of Tom Riddle's life. And the best, depending on how you feel about handcrafted soul mutilation. We know he makes multiple Horcruxes. We know murder is the price of admission. What we don't know, because Rowling never nails it down, is which specific murder snapped his soul for the first time. You might be asking yourself, does it actually matter whether it was the Riddle family or Myrtle? For the story HBO is going to tell, it really does. If you're like me, you probably lean Riddle family. It's neat. It's symbolic. It's Tom literally wiping out his Muggle past on the very day he steals the ring from his grandfather's corpse. But a lot of people make a strong case for Myrtle because that's his first deliberate, premeditated kill with the basilisk, and he already has the diary ready to go. Either way, you've got this perfect, awful pairing. A murder that proves he can do it, and an heirloom that proves he deserves to live forever. Now picture how HBO shoots this. We cut away from the murder itself. We've seen Avada Kedavra before, and drop into the aftermath. Tom alone in a tiny dark room. Could be the Gaunt Shack. Could be some forgotten Hogwarts classroom. No music, just his breathing, and maybe distant pipes hissing like snakes in the walls. He sets the ring, or the diary, on the floor in front of him, like an offering. Then the ritual starts. Not a big Marvel light show. Quiet. Wrong. He's chanting in Parseltongue, and in case you've forgotten, that language already sounds like a curse even when you're just asking a snake for directions. Blood beads on his hand, or maybe from the corpse off-screen, and it doesn't drip down, it pulls sideways into the object like it's thirsty. The air bends, the candlelight stretches. His shadow on the wall starts moving out of sync with his body. This is where you make it hurt. Horcruxes aren't just evil jewelry, they're self-harm on a metaphysical level. Voldemort is choosing to carve up his own soul. I mean, come on. That is body horror begging to be visual. You don't have to take my word for it. Rowling literally calls it the supreme act of evil. HBO could show his spine arching at impossible angles, veins going black for a second, his eyes rolling back as something tears loose inside him that we can't see, only feel. And when it's over, he doesn't just stand up and dust himself off. He should look off. Not fully snake face yet, but slightly wrong in ways you can't quite name. Maybe his reflection in a cracked mirror lags half a second behind. Maybe when someone touches his arm later, he flinches like the contact is too bright. Emotions don't land right anymore. He laughs at the wrong time, or doesn't react at all when another kid is crying. From that point on, every Horcrux isn't just an object, it's a symptom. Once you've watched one soul splitting in detail, every casual mention of, "Oh yeah, he hid part of himself in a cup," is going to feel way heavier, because you know exactly what that cost looked like. And the really scary part? That first time is probably the hardest, which raises a very ugly question about how the next 6 went. And that ugly question is, what happens when murder isn't an event for you anymore? It's a routine. Because each Horcrux isn't just a kill plus paperwork. It's a kill plus a bespoke, one-of-a-kind, soul-ripping ritual. We're talking candles, chanting, intent, probably some very cursed incense. He doesn't just kill often, he ritualizes killing into a spiritual practice. If you're like me, you might be asking yourself at what point that stops being crime and starts being liturgy. Tom Riddle isn't just removing obstacles, he's holding mass for himself every time he decides, yeah, you get to be a diary today. In case you've forgotten, the books are very clear that this is not a casual spell. Slughorn is horrified just hearing the theory. So imagine doing that 6 more times, on purpose, and feeling less every single time. And the text quietly backs that up. Early Tom is handsome, charming, reads as slightly cold prefect who's going to be minister one day. By the time we hit the flashback with Hepzibah Smith, his features are sharpening. His eyes are described as darker, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Jump to the graveyard in Goblet, and he's literally snake-faced, with red eyes, slits for nostrils, and a voice that's high and cold. You don't need a healer to tell you something has gone very wrong in the soul department. Emotionally, the range shrinks too. Young Tom can fake warmth, curiosity, even gratitude. Later, Voldemort is pretty much operating on 2 settings, rage and contempt, with the occasional smug amusement when he's torturing someone. His magic tracks that. Spells that should be precise become explosive. He blows up people, houses, his own followers when he's annoyed. It's like every time he tears his soul, he loses some fine motor control on being a person. Now, HBO is going to have seasons to show this decay instead of just jumping from orphan boy to noseless war criminal. You don't have to take my word for it. You can already see how prestige shows love a slow transformation. Imagine, in year 1, Tom's just a slightly too still kid at the orphanage. By his Hogwarts years, subtle makeup shifts, cheekbones a bit sharper, pupils a bit off, movements a little too smooth. Season by season, they dial it up. Fingers lingering too long on someone's shoulder. A smile that never blinks. Moments where even Bellatrix, who is not exactly Miss Boundaries, flinches and doesn't know why. Here's the pattern interrupt. What if immortality isn't majestic at all? No shining ascension, no enlightened Lich King. Just a body and mind eroded by repeated acts of desecration until Voldemort is basically a walking monument made of every life he's destroyed. Every time he enters a room, HBO can frame it so you feel the weight of 7 murders humming around him like static. And the creepiest part, we haven't even talked about the final Horcruxes yet, because once you get to the later ones, especially Nagini, you're opening the door to some much stranger, darker lore that the films barely nodded at, and that's where things stop being evil wizard and start getting genuinely uncanny. And the weirdest one isn't a locket or a cup or even the cursed tiara. It's the snake. Because Nagini isn't just Voldemort's emotional support reptile, She's literally a living Horcrux walking around like a murder Roomba. In case you've forgotten, a Horcrux is a container for a sliced-off bit of soul. With Nagini, that means a fragment of Voldemort is inside her at all times, which creates this constant, low-level psychic feedback loop between man and snake. The movies treat that like a Bluetooth connection for plot stuff. Oh no, Harry's seeing through Nagini again. Guess we've got to move the story along. But if you're like me, you look at that and go, okay, but what does that actually feel like? This is where HBO can get gross in a very fun way. We're going to lean into body horror and soul horror at the same time. Picture Voldemort sitting in some ruined manor, perfectly still, and then his nostrils flare at the scent of blood that only Nagini can actually smell. Or he licks his teeth because he's suddenly hungry for warm, living prey, even though he doesn't need food in any normal way anymore. You might be asking yourself, is that Nagini's instinct bleeding into him? Or is his fragment inside her corrupting what a snake even is? The show could push this further by making Nagini's movements just a little too human. She pauses to look at someone like she's sizing them up, not as food, but as a rival. She circles Voldemort's chair the way a person paces when they're anxious. Maybe when he speaks parcel tongue, her jaw moves a fraction of a second before the sound, like the soul in her is trying to answer first. I mean, come on, that's way creepier than big CGI snake hisses and jump scare. And then we hit the Fantastic Beasts retcon. Nagini as a cursed human, trapped in her snake form by a blood curse, is controversial, but if HBO chooses to use it, the horror level spikes. Suddenly, this isn't just a pet with a soul shard. It's a once-human woman, fully conscious, whose body is being used as a storage locker for the worst man in history. You don't have to take my word for it. Imagine a flashback where we see her as a person, and then cut hard to present-day Nagini, eyes blank, while Voldemort casually rests his pale hand on her head like she's furniture. Even if HBO skips the retcon, the ethical nightmare is still baked in. He chose a living, thinking creature for convenience. That living Horcrux is basically a preview of what's coming for him, because when Voldemort's soul is finally too shredded to die, he ends up in that King's Cross limbo as something not quite alive, not quite dead, a spiritual Nagini, trapped, reduced to instinct and pain. The snake is the rehearsal. The train station is the final performance. And if you follow that thread, it leads straight into the question of what's actually left of Voldemort by the end, which is where the next piece of this iceberg gets really uncomfortable. So if that King's Cross thing is what's left of Voldemort at the end, Level 5 is about what it felt like when that thing was winning. This is where he stops being a spooky background boogeyman and basically turns the whole setting into a prestige war show. We're going to the First Wizarding War. In the books, that era is like this haunted negative space. You get newspaper clippings, you get people going quiet when Harry walks into a room, you get Lupin saying, "You have no idea what it was like," and then we cut back to homework. You might be asking yourself, how bad was it really? Because the text only gives us these little shards. People disappearing, families wiped out, the Longbottoms tortured into insanity. That's not flavor text, that's occupied country language. And HBO lives on this kind of thing. They know how to do the slow burn war story where the front line isn't a trench. It's your street, your job, your dinner table. Imagine a season where, instead of Hogwarts hijinks, the camera stays with the adults we only ever hear about. Moody before the paranoia is justified. Young McGonagall, the original Order of the Phoenix trying to hold the line while the world quietly stops believing in lines. You don't have to take my word for it that the books are already pointing there. In case you've forgotten, Hagrid literally describes Death Eaters turning up in the middle of the night, blowing up houses, wiping out families. That's a raid. The you-know-who supporters at the Ministry are not just an Easter egg. That's institutional capture. You can almost see the HBO episode titles: Disappearance, Inquiry, New Regulations. Tonally, this is where the whimsy dies. Wands stop being quirky personality quizzes and start being guns. You get families going into hiding with Fidelius charms that might fail, parents arguing in whispers about whether to send their kids to Hogwarts or keep them home, because is the train safe this year or not? If you're like me, you read those throwaway lines about they were killed by Death Eaters as a kid and kind of skimmed past them. An HBO version doesn't let you skim. It sits you in the living room when the Order member doesn't come home, and the moral stuff gets ugly fast. Order members having to choose between saving one person now or protecting a safe house full of people later. Aurors quietly using borderline illegal curses because the law is always 3 steps behind terror. Neighbors deciding whether to report the weird chanting next door or pretend they didn't hear it because they like being alive. We've barely even touched the worst of it. The Longbottom's torture, the way the Ministry rots from the inside, the show trial justice system that comes after, that's the next layer down. And once you look at what actually happened to people like the Longbottoms, the word terror starts to feel a little small. And that terror isn't just Voldemort waving his wand around like a murder sprinkler. It's the people who choose to stand behind him. In the movies, Death Eaters are basically stormtroopers in Halloween costumes. They swoop in, yell a bit, fire some green sparks, and then get blasted away by the power of love or whatever's handy. Faceless, nameless, kind of interchangeable. But if you're like me, and you actually went back to the books, you start to notice something way worse. These are not just goons. They're a whole spectrum of people, from true believer fanatics to bored rich sadists to terrified opportunists who figure, hey, better on the winning side, right? You've got Lucius Malfoy, respectable Ministry donor, who didn't realize that Diary was a WMD. You've got Bellatrix, who is basically religiously in love with Voldemort. You've got people like Avery who grovel and weep and still show up next time. This is not a henchman problem. This is an ecosystem. Now imagine HBO treating Death Eaters not as a mosh pit in skull masks, but as extremist cells. Secret meetings in the back room of Borgin and Burke's. Coded messages hidden in the Daily Prophet classifieds. Pure-blood youth hanging out after Hogwarts, getting radicalized over fire whiskey and "Did you know Muggles almost wiped us out once?" rants. We're going to see recruitment, grooming, and group chats with wands. You might be asking yourself, is that too real for Harry Potter? And I'm going to say, have you read the parts about the Longbottoms? Picture a cold open where a seemingly random family disappears overnight. No bodies, just a dark mark and a house torn apart, like the magical version of a car bomb. Or coordinated attacks. One team hits the Ministry Records office while another, accidentally, sets off a werewolf incident in Diagon Alley to pull the Aurors away. That's what organized terror looks like. It's not loud all the time. It's precise. And the really nasty part is the respectability. In case you've forgotten, a ton of these people sit on Wizengamot benches, run shops, fund charities. By day, they're complaining about parchment shortages at committee meetings. By night, they're at a manor house watching someone get crucioed for sport. Prestige TV lives on that duality. We could literally follow one Death Eater dad from a school governor meeting about curriculum standards straight into a mask fitting before a raid. You don't have to take my word for it that this all orbits Voldemort's charisma. He doesn't just scare them. He gives them a story. You're the chosen blood. History cheated you. We're going to fix it. That ideology lets them reframe their cruelty as destiny. It's not, I like hurting people. It's, I'm purifying the world. I mean, come on. That's way scarier than he paid well. And once HBO turns Death Eaters into fully realized, horrible people with lives, families, and Slack channel from hell organization, Voldemort stops feeling like a lone supervillain. He becomes the nucleus of a movement, the dark sun everything else orbits, which raises an even creepier question. What does that do to the kids who grow up in that orbit? For Neville Longbottom, that orbit isn't abstract politics or scary headlines. It's his parents' screams. In case you've forgotten, Frank and Alice Longbottom are not dead in canon. They might as well be, but they're not. Bellatrix Lestrange and a few other Death Eaters capture them after Voldemort's first fall, and instead of just killing them, they decide to go for something worse. Prolonged Cruciatus until their minds snap. Not one curse, not a duel gone wrong, but a deliberate experiment in how much pain a human psyche can take before it just lets go. The movies toss this out in, what, 2 lines from Moody and a sad hospital visit photo? You might be asking yourself, do we really want to see that on screen? And the answer for HBO is, yeah, kind of, but carefully. Because if you're like me, the idea of someone choosing to break your parents' minds, leaving their bodies alive as a souvenir, is way more terrifying than another green flash. We're going to start with the lead-up, because that's where long-form TV eats. Imagine an episode where Frank, an Auror, is tracking rumors of rogue Death Eaters who refuse to accept Voldemort's defeat. You see the Order tired, hopeful, trying to rebuild. You see Alice tucking baby Neville into bed, while the radio mutters about trials and Azkaban sentences. You know what's coming, and the show knows you know, and it just lets that dread sit there. Then the attack. Not gore, not torture porn, just psychological horror dialed to 11. A dark house, wands on the floor, a broken doorframe. You hear the Cruciatus before you see anything. Those high, ragged screams, Bellatrix laughing like this is the best night of her life. Someone begging, someone promising they don't know where Voldemort is. The camera doesn't need to show bones snapping. It can stay on a dropped photograph of baby Neville, shaking on the floor with every curse. And the aftermath lives at St. Mungo's. HBO could spend real time in that ward. Frank staring at the same spot on the wall, Alice's hands trembling as she folds gum wrappers, the staff talking around them instead of to them. Little Neville being lifted up to say hello to parents who don't say his name back. I mean, come on, that's nightmare fuel wrapped in a family visit. You don't have to take my word for it. The books already tell us Neville grows up visiting them, clutching those gum wrappers like they're proof his mum is still in there somewhere. An HBO version can stretch that over seasons. Every time we cut back, he's taller, more closed off, a little braver. His boggart is Snape, sure, but under that? It's the Cruciatus. It's Bellatrix's laughter. And suddenly, when Neville stands up to Voldemort at Hogwarts, it's not just the shy kid had a glow-up. It's a boy whose entire life has been shaped by one night of Voldemort's war finally talking back. And this is just one family's horror story. Multiply that by dozens of households, dozens of missing parents, and you start to see the kind of personal, specific damage HBO could explore to make Voldemort's reign feel like a real historical trauma, not just a backdrop for prophecy drama. And that's just inside people's houses. Once you step into the ministry during Voldemort's rise, the horror gets way less cozy and way more fluorescent. It's not haunted castles anymore, it's haunted paperwork. During the First Wizarding War, the Ministry is supposedly the side of law and order. In case you've forgotten, what we actually hear is that they're overwhelmed, panicking, and partially infiltrated. You've got Death Eaters in masks outside, sympathizers in nice robes inside, and in the middle, a bunch of terrified bureaucrats rubber-stamping whatever looks tough on dark wizards. You might be asking yourself, who's actually in charge here? And the uncomfortable answer is, basically, no one. This is where HBO can lean hard into bureaucratic horror. Picture overworked aurors asleep at their desks, cold coffee everywhere, magical memos literally dive-bombing them like angry origami birds. Every time one opens, it's another sighting, another disappearance, another urgent meeting that solves nothing. We're going to see corridors full of people pretending they know what they're doing, while the building itself feels like it's running on fear. Secret meetings in dark offices, blinds half shut even though it's underground anyway, someone quietly casting muffliato before saying, "Off the record." That's horror. Not jump scares, but watching decent people make tiny compromises, one form, one signature, one exception at a time, until the rule of law is just vibes. And you don't have to take my word for it. The books straight up tell you this happened. Barty Crouch Sr. literally authorizes extreme measures. He's throwing suspected Death Eaters into Azkaban without trial, bragging about how efficient it is. Innocent people get swept up in the dragnet. We meet some of them later as broken wrecks, or we only hear their names in passing, which is somehow worse. I mean, come on. When Sirius tells Harry he was locked up without a proper trial, that's not just, oops, paperwork glitch. That's policy. If you're like me, you probably read that as a kid and went, wow, that's harsh, and then moved on to Quidditch. But as an adult, it starts to feel eerily familiar. Institutions under pressure from terrorism or war start doing the same stuff. Emergency powers, surveillance, indefinite detention, show trials to prove they're doing something. The wizarding world isn't special. It just has owls. HBO can make that parallel uncomfortably sharp. Imagine public Wizengamot hearings that are basically theater. Headlines screaming about security, while families whisper that the Ministry can't actually protect anyone. People stop reporting Death Eater threats because what's the point when your neighbor might be on the Dark Lord's payroll and your own government might throw you in Azkaban by mistake? And here's the kicker. Voldemort's first fall doesn't magically fix any of this. It just buries it. Crouch is disgraced. Files get sealed. Everyone agrees not to talk about the time the good guys went a little Azkaban happy. Which raises a nasty question we'll get to soon. When Harry's era rolls around, is the Ministry really infiltrated for the first time? Or are we just watching old rot finally crawl back into the light? So let's go to the night when all that buried rot should have been ripped out for good. Level 6 is the point where the story, on paper, ends. Voldemort wins the war, walks into a cottage in Godric's Hollow, and casually makes the mistake that's going to kill him. In the movies, you blink and you miss it. A green flash here, a crying baby there, some sepia flashback fog, and we're done. But an HBO show? If you're like me, you look at that and go, wait, why is this not an entire season? We've got the prophecy hanging over everything. We've got Dumbledore playing 12-dimensional chess. We've got the Fidelius charm turning a house into a secret inside someone's skull. And we've got Peter Pettigrew quietly sweating through all of it. You might be asking yourself, how do you stretch Baby Gets Cursed into 10 episodes without it feeling like filler? Easy. You don't start with the baby. You start with the prophecy room at the Ministry, with Trelawney choking on a voice that isn't hers while Snape listens at the door. You follow him sprinting to Voldemort, then slinking back to Dumbledore. You watch James and Lily argue about who to trust, Sirius insisting he should be secret keeper, and Peter, who looks like comic relief, signing his friend's death warrant with a shaky hand. And then you slow everything way down. Domestic horror. HBO could give us a whole episode that's just the Potters in hiding. James making bad jokes while he does the washing up with magic. Lily writing letters she'll never send. Baby Harry chewing on a toy broom. It's warm. It's kind of boring. It feels safe. That's the point. Because when the Dark Lord finally walks up the path, you feel the intrusion. I mean, come on. Picture how they could shoot the actual attack. No big score at first, just the wind outside, a rattling gate, maybe the clock in the hallway ticking way too loud. James hears the ward scream, grabs his wand, yells for Lily. We never even see his duel. We just hear a single shout cut off by Avada Kedavra. The house goes quiet in that horrible way where you know someone is dead because the background noise of their existence has stopped. From Voldemort's side, it's almost boring. This is a victory lap. He's at the height of his power. He's already massacred families. He's torn his soul into pieces. And now he's here to kill. A baby. Trivial. Routine. You don't have to take my word for it. The books literally have him thinking about how easy it will be. HBO could lean into that overconfidence, the casual cruelty of a man who treats murder like paperwork. Then Lily. Her desperate pleas, backing up the stairs, bargaining with the most dangerous wizard alive who can't even comprehend why a mother wouldn't move aside. Harry screaming. The green light. And then the pattern breaks. Instead of another corpse, we get silence and dust and a wand falling from fingers that are already dissolving. This is where HBO gets weird. Imagine staying with Voldemort's POV as his body comes apart, but his awareness doesn't. No pain, just the sick, weightless realization that he miscalculated. The Horcruxes keep him tethered. But to what? A smear of consciousness, a thing that can't die and can't properly live, blown out of his own body like smoke. And in case you've forgotten, what happens to that soul fragment after Godric's Hollow is one of the strangest, most unsettling bits of lore we ever get. The movies barely touch it. An HBO series could drag you through every second of it, and we're going to talk about that next. So what does it actually feel like to be that smear of consciousness? Because if you're like me, you read Voldemort saying he was less than the meanest ghost, and just kind of went, cool, horrifying phrase, moving on. But if HBO wants to go darker, this is where you camp out. You turn that throwaway description into like 3 episodes of pure soul horror. After the curse rebounds at Godric's Hollow, his body is gone. Not damaged. Gone. But his soul can't go anywhere. Normally in this universe, you die. You get the King's Cross limbo. Maybe some ghost options. Maybe the Veil. Who knows? Voldemort has hard-locked himself out of all that. The Horcruxes act like rusty fishhooks in the river of death, yanking him back, stretching him into something that isn't alive and isn't properly dead. He's not a ghost with a personality and a tragic backstory. He's a stain. You might be asking yourself, okay, but how do you show a stain of consciousness on TV without it just looking like a bad screensaver? This is where HBO can get weird. Picture a dark, formless void, not quiet, but full of layered whispers, like every voice he's ever silenced still echoing around him. Sometimes it flickers, and he gets these warped glimpses of the living world. Baby Harry crying, Dumbledore's robes swishing past, the Gaunt Shack rotting away. He can see, but he can't touch. He can scream, but no one hears. And because we're going to lean into the parasitic angle, you show how he learns to cling. In canon, he admits he was forced to exist as a kind of bodiless parasite, latching onto snakes and small animals. HBO could literally give you his POV as he slips into the nervous system of a rat in the Albanian forest, or coils inside a snake, feeling its hunger and fear bleed into his own. The camera could keep glitching between raw animal instinct and Tom Riddle's cold, articulate thoughts, fighting for control. This is immortality as a curse. No speeches, no wand, just constant gnawing hunger and helplessness. He's sustained only by two things: the magical tether of his Horcruxes and pure, undiluted hatred. That's it. No joy, no physical sensation beyond whatever animal he's riding like a haunted Uber. And I mean, come on. That's so much worse than just, oh no, he's back without a nose. You don't have to take my word for it. The books already hint that his soul is so mutilated it can't be healed. And then, you slowly pivot toward Hogwarts. Strange headaches in the Forbidden Forest. Animals acting wrong. Until we land on Quirrell. The timid professor we meet in Philosopher's Stone stops being a goofy, stuttering side character and becomes the first real foothold in Voldemort's climb back to flesh. HBO could play his possession like a long, creeping infection, which we're going to dig into when we hit the Quirrell section. Quirrell is where Voldemort stops being a ghost story and starts being a parasite. In case you've forgotten, this isn't just evil guy under a hat. It's a full-on shared flesh situation. Canonically, Quirrell goes off on his little gap year to find dark creatures and gain experience. If you're like me, you read that as nervous academic tries to speedrun villainy. Somewhere in Albania, he actually finds Voldemort, or what's left of him, and instead of running away like any sane person, he bargains. The books are pretty blunt. Voldemort possessed him. By the time he's back at Hogwarts, the Dark Lord is literally riding shotgun in his skull, eventually manifesting as that face on the back of his head we see in the first movie. The film plays this mostly for a jump scare. Spin the chair, boom, double-headed professor. Kids in the audience spill their popcorn. But stretched across an HBO season? You might be asking yourself, how do you turn Quirrell into horror and not just a plot twist? You show the erosion. You let us watch this soft-spoken man get hollowed out from the inside. One compromise, one migraine, one whispered command at a time. Imagine early episodes where Quirrell is still mostly himself. He stutters, sure, but he also laughs. He writes careful notes. He flinches when students set off fireworks in the Great Hall. Then the headaches start. Quick flashes of pain that make him grab the table. We see him in the staff bathroom, gripping the sink, talking to his reflection. Except the reflection talks back a half-second late, with slightly different wording. Is that just stress? Or is something rehearsing how to use his mouth? We're going to get scenes of him alone in his quarters, whispering to the back of his own head. His hand moves before he decides to move it. His wand rises when he's terrified and wants to surrender. At first he can fight it. He can stop mid-curse, drop his arm, gasp like he's just surfaced from underwater. Over time, the ratio reverses. Voldemort is the driver. Quirrell is the seatbelt. Body horror sells it. Unexplained bruises along his spine where nothing should be touching him. Changes in appetite. One week he's nauseous at the sight of meat. The next he's shoveling rare steak like he hasn't eaten in days because, well, maybe he hasn't. Under the turban or bandages, we get slow, disgusting milestones. A raised welt that looks kind of like a lip. A patch of skin that twitches in sync with his breathing. An eye that opens for half a second in the mirror and then vanishes, leaving Quirrell sobbing because he knows something is literally growing out of him, and he can't tell anyone. I mean, come on. That is nightmare fuel. And you don't have to take my word for it. The books already say Voldemort can slide into people, animals, even the back of someone's head. HBO just has the budget and the runtime to make that feel like a season-long medical horror show. By the time we finally see full Snake Voldemort in Goblet of Fire, it's not sudden. It's the end of a long, grotesque incubation. And the really fun part? Quirrell is only the first body that breaks. Quirrell is only the first body that breaks, but level 7 is where we watch Voldemort finally put himself back together. This is the Little Hangleton graveyard. This is the moment he stops being a parasite and becomes a person again. Kind of. In case you've forgotten, Goblet of Fire in the book goes full occult horror here. Harry touches the portkey, and instead of a quick spin and a hard landing, it's described like being yanked through nothingness, dumped into a place that feels wrong. The movie gives you, 20 seconds of disorientation, and then boom, graveyard boss fight. HBO, we're going to spend an entire episode letting you dread that portkey. You see the cup. You remember it's a trap. You might be asking yourself, do I really want to watch the slow-motion car crash when I already know the ending? Yes, because the horror is in the waiting. The graveyard itself is a gift. The book talks about crooked headstones, cold mist, the Riddle Angel statue. The film kind of rushes past all that to get Cedric dead and Voldemort monologuing. An HBO version can lean into the geography. Long, quiet tracking shots of names you recognize from earlier lore, family plots, half-sunk graves, that massive Tom Riddle headstone looming over Harry like a literal spoiler. You can almost hear the production designer drooling. And then we get to pre-ritual Voldemort. The movie shows you a weird, shriveled baby thing, but it's fast, it's mostly in shadow, and the camera doesn't linger because, children's film. The book calls him a hairless, scaly creature with a flat snake face and raw red eyes, small enough to cradle but wrong in every proportion. HBO can let the body horror breathe, the way he moves like a spider and an infant at the same time, the wet sound when Wormtail handles him, the way he clings to that robe like he's ashamed of existing. Then the ritual itself. Bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy. The movie treats these like cool ingredients in a dark potion montage. But symbolically, it's Voldemort weaponizing every relationship he's ever had. He desecrates his father's grave to steal a bone, because the only thing he wants from his Muggle parent is structural support. He lets Wormtail cut off his own hand, because loyalty in Voldemort's world is measured in body parts. And he takes Harry's blood, the blood of the boy he tried to kill as a baby, literally bottling the prophecy into his veins. If you're like me, you read that as a kid, and didn't fully clock how ritualistically awful it is. HBO can slow it down. The scraping of the bone from the grave, Wormtail's hesitation before the knife falls, Harry realizing his blood isn't just fuel, it's a binding contract. I mean, come on, that's not just a spell, that's a thesis on abuse and exploitation. And when the cauldron boils and the new body steps out, we're going to pause on that in the next level. His changed flesh, his altered magic, what it actually does to a mind to come back from near non-existence. That's where the real nightmare starts. And to get to that nightmare, we have to talk about the recipe. Because this is one of those moments where the story quietly tells you how Voldemort understands relationships, by literally boiling them down into ingredients. In case you've forgotten, the spell is bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy. It sounds poetic when you're skimming, but if you're like me, the second you slow down, you realize, oh, this is just a family drama, a toxic workplace, and a child sacrifice joke all stacked in one cauldron. Start with bone of the father. They dig up Tom Riddle Sr. under the moon, from a grave Voldemort specifically chose. He could have used magic to conjure bone, right? But no. It has to be his father. The muggle he despised. The man whose name he still wears while pretending he's Lord Voldemort. You might be asking yourself, why is he even anchored to this guy he claims to hate? Because on some level, he can't stop orbiting that rejection. Desecrating the grave is Voldemort's final I win to a dad who never loved him. HBO can linger on that. The crunch of the shovel in wet dirt, the headstone cracking, the camera staying on the empty coffin while you hear the bone snap off-screen. It's not just spooky cemetery vibes, it's contempt for ancestry turned into a prop. Then we get Flesh of the Servant. Wormtail cutting off his own hand is already brutal in the book, but the movies kind of speedrun it. In an HBO version, this is workplace safety violations. The scene. Voldemort doesn't offer him a painless spell. He makes him do it himself. Slow, trembling. The wand light shaking. The knife or the silver dagger slipping on sweaty skin. With good sound design, that slice could be one of the most upsetting noises in the whole series, and it perfectly captures how Voldemort sees his followers. Not comrades, not even tools, just meat that walks itself to the slaughter. Loyalty is measured in how much of your body you're willing to leave behind. Finally, blood of the enemy. Harry, taken against his will while he's bound and helpless. This is where the horror gets intimate. We're going to see the needle, or knife, or whatever HBO uses, slide into his arm, the way his breath stutters, the way the blood drips into the potion like a contract being signed. Voldemort could have taken blood from any enemy, but he wants Harry because he's obsessed with that prophecy. He's so determined to master the conditions of his own downfall that he literally builds his body out of the boy who's meant to end him. I mean, come on. That's not just creepy. That's a Stalker X using your Netflix password to resurrect himself. Put those together, and the ritual is a dark mirror of birth. New body, but it's patchwork. Father's remains, servant's flesh, enemy's blood. No womb, just a cauldron. No joy, just screams. When he rises, HBO shouldn't make him look merely powerful. His magic and movements should feel wrong, like every step is slightly offbeat with the world he forced to create him. And if his body is wrong, what did that do to his mind? That's where we're going next. And if his body is wrong, what did that do to his mind? Well, first, we have to look at the body itself, because by Goblet of Fire, he's not just bald noseless guy. He's described as skeletal, skin the color of sour milk, with those slit-like nostrils and eyes that are straight up red. Not kind of bloodshot. Red. If you're like me, you read that at 11 and went, oh, so he's a snake now. And then the movie showed you Ralph Fiennes looking like an evil amphibian, and your brain just sort of shrugged and moved on. But on the page, it's way nastier. This is not a glam makeover. This is what happens when a soul that's been ripped apart and stitched back together keeps trying to live in a human frame. You might be asking yourself, is that just an edgy design choice, or is it actually baked into the magic? And the books quietly go, no, this is consequences. Years of dark rituals, Horcrux creation, possession, that weird wraith period on the back of Quirrell's head. His body is literally reshaping to match what's left of his humanity, which is to say, almost nothing. HBO can lean into that in a way the films never quite did. He shouldn't just stand there like a normal guy in fancy robes. His baseline presence should feel wrong. Imagine scenes where he's perfectly still for way too long, like a hunting snake that hasn't decided whether you're prey yet. Then, when he moves, it's this unsettling glide, joints bending just a little too smoothly, head tilting in those sharp, bird-like angles. His robes don't swish. They trail, like the air is thick around him. And the voice. I mean, come on. This is HBO. They can have fun with sound design. Instead of just creepy whisper man, give him a voice that feels like it's slightly out of sync with his mouth, like the sound is arriving a fraction of a second late, or echoing from somewhere behind you. Every word should grate on the air, like the room itself is flinching. In case you've forgotten, his physicality has always been dangerous on contact. Quirrell literally burns when he touches Harry. That's not just plot armor, it's the idea that Voldemort's essence is so corrupted that a body holding him becomes chemically incompatible with certain kinds of magic and love. HBO could show that as a recurring motif: candles guttering when he passes, animals panicking, Death Eaters flinching when his fingers brush their skin a second too long, like they've been dipped in ice water and poison at the same time. His very existence is toxic to normal human bodies, including his own. He has to keep rebuilding, patching, enchanting himself just to stay upright. And now that he's back, he's not hiding behind turban cosplay or school politics. He's openly torturing, killing, playing with his food in front of an audience. You don't have to take my word for it. The graveyard scene alone is basically a mission statement. Combine that with a body that looks and moves like a walking curse, and suddenly the theatrical, shouting movie villain starts to feel almost safe by comparison. But here's the real nightmare. If the body is that warped, what does that say about the thing driving it, and how much of Tom Riddle is actually left inside the monster? Level 8 is where we stop looking at Voldemort as a jump scare and start treating him like a crime scene. Not the body, the mind. Because if the flesh is that warped, what does the operating system look like? And how do you even film a brain that's basically been whittled down to one obsession and a bunch of spite? We actually have more material on his psychology than you might remember. The books keep shoving you inside his head. Those visions where Harry is suddenly standing in a cold room, looking out through Voldemort's eyes, feeling that weird, clinical satisfaction when someone gets tortured. Dumbledore spends whole chapters doing post-mortem analysis on Tom Riddle like he's defending a very cursed PhD thesis, terrified of death, obsessed with control, incapable of genuine attachment. You don't have to take my word for it. In case you've forgotten, this is the kid who literally collected trophies from the children he terrorized at the orphanage and then smiled politely at the adults. On HBO, that doesn't have to stay in exposition. You might be asking yourself, okay, but how do you show no capacity for love without just having Dumbledore monologue about it again? Easy. You turn his mind into a set. Imagine dream sequences or vision episodes where we're walking through Voldemort's inner world with Harry, or even with Voldemort himself, and the geography tells you what's broken. Picture endless stone corridors, all identical, lit like the Ministry, but colder, every door locked from the inside. Names scratched off, memories filed away, or a throne room that looks impressive at first glance, until you realize the decorations are trophies from his crimes. The diary, the cup, the locket. Maybe a child's toy from the orphanage, each one lovingly displayed, but emotionally meaningless. It's a museum curated by someone who understands possession but not value. And the horror isn't just the props, it's the emotional flatness. If you're like me, you probably grew up with the movie Voldemort as this theatrical screamer. But Book Voldemort is mostly bored, cold. He doesn't understand why Bellatrix is fanboying so hard. He doesn't understand why Snape is risking anything for a dead woman. He literally cannot process why a mother would step in front of a curse instead of running. When that calm cracks, what leaks out isn't adult rage. It's something almost toddler-like. The shrieking after the prophecy, the smashing of things when a Horcrux is destroyed, that petulant, how dare they energy that makes him feel stunted under all the power. HBO can weaponize that. One episode, you're in his head as he hears the prophecy for the first time, watching the exact moment paranoia becomes destiny. Another, you're stuck in his Hogwarts fixation dream, where the castle keeps rejecting him no matter how many times he walks those corridors. And somewhere near the end, we're going to sit with the thing he never understands. People calmly choosing to die for each other, and the one kind of magic his labyrinth of locked doors can't keep out. And that brings us to the thing that quietly drives all of this. One sentence in a smoky back room that Tom Riddle hears secondhand and decides is the voice of the universe. In case you've forgotten, he doesn't even get the full prophecy. He gets a bootleg snippet, a child born at the end of July who has the power to vanquish the Dark Lord. That's it. No name, no address, no GPS coordinates. And what does he do? He immediately starts baby hunting. You might be asking yourself, why is that the move? Why not just, I don't know, become unkillable first and worry about the infant later? But this is where Voldemort stops being scary wizard boss fight and becomes a walking, talking, self-fulfilling loop. By choosing to act on that half-heard prophecy, he literally manufactures the one person who can kill him. He marks the child as his equal, he pours his own soul into Harry's scar, and then spends the next 17 years being shocked that destiny keeps boomeranging back. And underneath that decision is the thing he never says out loud. He is absolutely terrified of dying. Not like mildly concerned, existentially screaming inside. Remember, this is a kid who grew up in a gray Muggle orphanage where people left and never came back, who already knew nobody was lighting candles for his memory. If you're like me, you read those scenes and go, oh, this is a person who decided very early that oblivion is the worst thing that can happen, and that love or legacy are just fairy stories adults tell themselves so they don't panic. So when he learns about Horcruxes, it's game over. Of course he goes straight to soul mutilation. Of course he starts preemptively murdering children who might maybe someday be a threat. I mean, come on. This is a guy who looks at an unborn baby and thinks, competition. HBO can lean into that by showing his internal reaction when Snape reports the prophecy. Quick, ugly flashes of Wool's orphanage, the cold bed, Mrs. Cole's disappointed face, then the Gaunt Shack and his grandfather's corpse, all smashing together into this rising, suffocating panic he refuses to call fear. On the outside, he's calm, asking clinical questions. On the inside, the walls are closing in. We're going to watch him choose ego over reality in real time. He could walk away, decide prophecies are nonsense, accept that one day he'll die like everyone else. Instead, he doubles down and tears his soul apart, trying to outrun a fact. And that's the real horror. Not the snake face. Not the green light. A man so powerful and yet so emotionally stunted that he cannot accept the one universal human truth. Put him next to Dumbledore quietly, talking about the next great adventure, or Harry walking into the forest and dropping the Elder Wand later, and Voldemort suddenly looks not just evil, but small, pathetic, even. The HBO version can really sit in that contrast, because our next stop is how the people who accept death end up wielding a kind of magic he can't even see. And that's the punchline, right? Voldemort can stare death in the face and still not get what's actually protecting people from him. He's playing wizard chess without realizing half the pieces are even on the board. In case you've forgotten, multiple characters flat out tell you this. Dumbledore keeps hammering it. Voldemort doesn't understand love. He doesn't get why Lily stepping in front of Harry does anything. He writes it off as sentimental nonsense, some weak, stupid impulse that any sensible person would avoid. You might be asking yourself, okay, but isn't that just him being mean? No, it's deeper. It's a cognitive blind spot. His brain literally files self-sacrifice under temporary insanity, so he underestimates it every single time. Look at how he reads loyalty. In his head, people stay because they're scared, or because they want power, or because they're too cowardly to leave. That's it. That's the whole menu. Bellatrix's obsession? He reads it as useful fanaticism, not affection. Narcissa lying to him about Harry being dead out of love for Draco? He doesn't even notice the love part. He just sees a useful answer in the moment. I mean, come on. The man has a pet snake, but still can't clock emotional attachment. HBO can get really creepy with this. Imagine an extended scene in the First Wizarding War where a Death Eater begs him to spare their partner, not out of fear, but because they love them. Tom's face just glitches. Confusion first, like he's hearing a language he never learned, then anger because he feels manipulated by something he can't name. Or a follower who keeps serving him even when he's weak, like post-Baby Voldemort Albania era, and he cannot process why someone would stay without the constant threat of torture. That's horror. Watching a human-shaped thing fail to recognize basic humanity. And the misreads? HBO could feast on those. He assumes Harry will ditch his friends if things get bad enough, because that's exactly what Tom Riddle would do. He assumes Snape is only in it for himself, because if you're like me, you read Half-Blood Prince and go, yeah, this is a guy projecting his own emptiness onto literally everyone. Snape's love for Lily, twisted as it is invisible to him. He clocks the jealousy, the bitterness, the ambition. The love just doesn't render. That's what makes him terrifying. Whole categories of behavior don't exist in his mental model, which means he can't predict them, which means he overreacts when they happen. People who can't see love can't see half the reasons you might do something irrational, and that makes them unpredictable in exactly the wrong way. The tragic part is that this blind spot is also the crack in his armor. It's why Lily's protection works, why Harry's walk into the forest works, why his followers peel away the second real bonds outweigh fear. He can't plan for magic he doesn't believe is real. And HBO can wind that all the way back to Tom in the orphanage, showing how early that door closed in his head, and what had to happen to pry it open, just a little, at the very end. Because something does get through, and what that is takes us into an even darker layer of Voldemort's story. And speaking of darker layers, we're going to crank it up another notch. Level 9 is where Voldemort does something way scarier than duel Dumbledore or shout about no more meddling. He takes over school. He turns Hogwarts, the cozy castle in your childhood brain, into an occupied zone. If you're like me, you probably still half expect the Great Hall ceiling whenever you walk into a big dining room. Hogwarts is coded as comfort food. It's the place with pumpkin juice, moving staircases, and teachers who are strict but secretly kind. In Deathly Hallows, that entire vibe gets quietly strangled. The movies give you a couple shots of Snape glaring and some kids marching in lines. The books are like, no, this is a police state with a homework schedule. In case you've forgotten, Voldemort doesn't even bother sitting in the headmaster's chair most of the time. He outsources. He installs the Carrows, who are basically Death Eater substitute teachers from your worst anxiety dream. Dark arts becomes a core subject, not defense against. And it's not, let's analyze the unforgivable curses from a safe academic distance. It's, hey, who wants to practice Crucio on a classmate today? You might be asking yourself, How much darker can you really make that on HBO without it just turning into torture porn? The answer is, by slowing down, by making it mundane. One of the most chilling things the show could do is spend entire episodes inside those classes. You see attendance sheets. You see Muggle-born kids singled out for special discipline. You watch the lesson drift from theory into, pair up, one of you begs. Pattern interrupt for your nostalgia. Remember how the corridors used to be for sneaking to the kitchens or dodging filch? Now imagine those same hallways lined with propaganda posters about blood purity, with bruised kids pressed against the stone, trying not to make eye contact with patrolling Slytherins in prefect badges. The fat lady's portrait, who used to get tipsy and sing, now forced to announce curfew violations to the Carrows. I mean, come on. That's the kind of quiet, systemic horror TV is built for. And HBO has time to show the resistance forming in the cracks. Dumbledore's army meetings don't just pop back into existence fully formed. They grow out of whispered conversations in the dorms, smuggled food to the dungeons where Muggleborns are held, first years learning that detention can mean being used as a target dummy. You don't have to take my word for it. The book literally has Neville coming back. From punishment, bleeding, and burned. Neville's arc here is begging for a multi-episode focus. The kid who used to lose his toad becoming the de facto commander of a school under occupation. But HBO could also zoom in on the ones we barely see. The terrified 11-year-old sorted into Slytherin and handed a wand and a slur on day one, or the Hufflepuff who breaks under Carrow lessons and starts enjoying it. What does that do to a generation? What happens when your first memory of magic is using it to hurt someone so you don't get hurt? That psychological fallout, the kids who leave Hogwarts already carrying war crimes, is its own level of horror. And it sets up the next layer of what Voldemort really leaves behind. And that brings us to the kid who quietly turns all of that fallout into a war. Neville's War. If you're like me, you grew up thinking Neville was comic relief with a pet plant and anxiety issues, and then you hit Deathly Hallows and suddenly he's leading a student insurgency like This Is Hogwarts, Occupied Territory Edition. In case you've forgotten, by the time Harry's off hunting Horcruxes, Neville is back at school under the Carrows, who are basically Voldemort's substitute teachers from hell. We go from, oops, I melted my cauldron, to detention means being cruciated in front of your friends, in 1 year. And Neville, the kid who used to lose his toad every 5 minutes, starts organizing Dumbledore's army again, breaking into the Room of Requirement, planning sabotage, protecting first years who can't even cast a shield charm yet. You might be asking yourself, where's Voldemort in all this? And that's the point. He's almost never physically at Hogwarts during this period. He's off doing big-picture Dark Lord stuff, hunting wands, planning raids, having weird snake dinners. But every single thing the Carrows do, every curse taught in dark arts class, every punishment carved into someone's hand, is an echo of his ideology. It's his orders filtered through petty, cruel middle management. This is where HBO can get really nasty in a good storytelling way. We're going to see intercutting. Picture an episode where Voldemort is at Malfoy Manor, calmly discussing strategy. We must tighten control at Hogwarts, root out disloyalty, make examples. Very abstract, very boardroom. Then cut straight to Neville being forced to watch a third year get tortured for refusing to use the Cruciatus curse on a classmate. Same order, two totally different emotional temperatures. I mean, come on, that's so much scarier than just seeing him scream Avada Kedavra with dramatic lighting. Because now Voldemort isn't just a jump scare boss fight at the end. He's the invisible hand behind every timetable change and every missing student. The show can linger on the grind. The bruises Neville hides under his robes, the whispered passwords, the way kids flinch when the door opens because it might be a Caro or, worse, a classmate ready to snitch. And the horror really lands when you remember these are children playing resistance fighter. Neville taking beatings so the younger ones don't have to. Luna and Ginny tending to injuries in the room of requirement with stolen potion supplies and shaky healing charms. Kids debating whether to blow up a corridor and maybe hurt someone, because if they don't, the Caros will hurt more people later. You don't have to take my word for it. The book barely sketches this, and it's already bleak. Give HBO 10 episodes and they can make it feel like a full occupation arc. By the end of that, Voldemort starts to feel less like a guy and more like a system. He's in the rules, in the curriculum, in the way students start watching each other. And once you see him that way, the next stage of his horror gets even worse. And when a person turns into a system, the next question is ugly. What does that system actually do all day? Under Voldemort's ministry, one of the main answers is, it calls you in for a nice, polite interview and quietly erases your life. If you're like me, you probably remember the Muggle-born Registration Commission as that time Umbridge wore Slytherin cosplay and made people cry. But the setup is way darker. Muggle-borns get official summons. They're told to appear before a panel, and the core accusation is basically, you stole magic from real wizards. Not you forged documents, not you broke a law, but your existence is a crime against our ideology. I mean, come on, that's not even pretending to be justice. That's a purity cult with letterhead. The books only give us a slice of this with Mary Cattermole's hearing. In case you've forgotten, she's sitting in front of a Dementor, shaking, while Umbridge and Yaxley calmly explain that her wand will be confiscated and she'll be taken for questioning. We never see what happens next, but the subtext is loud. Imprisonment at best, disappearance at worst. And the really chilling bit, this whole thing is wrapped in procedural language. Commission, registration, interviews. It's all fake neutrality covering real violence. You might be asking yourself, how does HBO make that scarier without just turning it into torture porn? The answer is, you lean into the banality. Cold, echoing courtrooms where you can hear every sniffle. Families clutching folders of useless paperwork. Smug officials stamping forms like they're approving parking permits, while someone in the background quietly sobs. We're going to see clerks sorting files labeled Muggle-born disposition with color-coded tabs, and nobody even looks up when someone is led away in chains. No green flashes, no dramatic duels, just the quiet efficiency of evil moving through in-trays and out-trays. And the worst part isn't even the Death Eaters. It's the ordinary people. The witch at the front desk who keeps her head down and just processes the summons. The guard who escorts kids to holding cells and tells himself he's only following orders. The minor functionary who laughs a little too hard at Umbridge's jokes because he wants to keep his job. You don't have to take my word for it. Real history is full of people who stamped, filed, and scheduled atrocities into existence. That's where the real-world parallels come roaring in. Registration laws, confiscated property, resettlement. HBO can frame the Muggle-born roundups like an exaggerated mirror of the worst bureaucratic persecutions we've actually done to each other, and suddenly Voldemort's world stops feeling like fantasy and starts feeling uncomfortably familiar. And once you see that, once you realize the wizarding world can slide into fascism with a few memos and a new logo, the next thing Voldemort does to rewrite who counts as human gets even more disturbing. And once you see that bureaucratic slide into fascism, you kind of hit this awful realization. If the system is that fragile, what happens when Voldemort himself finally breaks? Because we're going to drop all the way down to level 10 now, and this is the bottom of the iceberg. This is the Battle of Hogwarts, his last stand, and what it actually means when a man with an already shattered soul dies. You might be asking yourself, didn't we already see that? Green light, dust, done? And yeah, the movies give you a very cool visual spectacle. Cloaks whipping around, spells in slow motion, Voldemort flaking away like evil Parmesan. It looks great. But in the books, that final stretch is way less about fireworks and way more about the slow, humiliating unraveling of all his protections. Every Horcrux gone. Every safeguard he built out of paranoia and stolen magic just failing in public. In case you've forgotten, Book Voldemort spends that whole night losing control of the narrative. The Elder Wand doesn't obey him. His Death Eaters are deserting. Narcissa lies to his face because her love for Draco is stronger than her fear of him. Loyalty, the thing he never believed in, is literally what walks Harry out of the forest alive. The films kind of turn this into a chase scene on the battlements. The books turn it into an argument in the Great Hall where Voldemort gets fact-checked to death. An HBO version could lean into that in a really nasty way. Imagine episodes that alternate between big, chaotic battle stuff and these tight, suffocating little confrontations where people calmly tell Voldemort he's wrong. McGonagall refusing to kneel. Kingsley dueling him while shouting the truth about the wand. Even random Death Eaters, panicking, trying to slip away while he realizes fear doesn't equal loyalty. If you're like me, you want to see the exact moment his composure cracks, not just the moment his body does. Pattern interrupt for your nightmares. That thing under the bench at King's Cross. Because all of this only really lands if the show keeps cutting back to the metaphysical horror we briefly see in Deathly Hallows. That flayed, whimpering soul fragment in Harry's limbo? I mean, come on. It's described like something half-skinned and gasping, too ruined to be helped. That's not just a creepy image. That is the visual receipt for every Horcrux, every murder, every time he said, "My soul, I'll just tear off another piece. It'll be fine." You don't have to take my word for it. The text is begging you to realize he's been self-harm speedrunning his own existence. And HBO could use that as the key. Intercut the final duel with that thing under the bench, getting smaller, weaker, as each Horcrux falls, until you're left wondering, when Voldemort's body dies in the Great Hall, what exactly is left to go anywhere? In the next section, we'll sit with that King's Cross scene and ask what it really means to mutilate your soul past the point of repair. So, about that thing under the bench. We cut from the chaos of the forest to this bright, misty, almost comforting King's Cross knockoff, and you might be asking yourself, okay, did Harry just respawn? It's quiet. It's clean. It's the anti-Voldemort aesthetic. And then you hear it. That wet, ragged, high-pitched crying from somewhere nearby. Harry walks toward the sound, and tucked under a bench is this small, flayed creature, gasping and whimpering, and Dumbledore just calmly says they cannot help it. That's the part the movies kind of skate over. In case you've forgotten, this isn't some random demon baby. That thing is the piece of Voldemort's soul that hitched a ride in Harry's scar, the accidental Horcrux, finally ripped free by the killing curse. We're looking at soul damage in its raw form. No robes, no wand, no melodramatic speeches. Just what repeated, deliberate mutilation of your own essence actually looks like when you strip away the theatrics. If you're like me, that is way scarier than any snake face. HBO is going to love this scene. You lean hard into the uncanny. the creature's proportions just slightly off, limbs too thin, ribs twitching when it breathes, the skin looking both burned and newborn. It tries to crawl away from Harry, but it doesn't move right, like its joints were put together by someone who only saw a human once. And the sound design. Not just crying, but these horrible wet breaths, half-formed words, maybe little hisses of parcel tongue that don't quite become language. Harry's reaction is crucial. He's repulsed, sure, but he also feels this instinctive pity, like his body remembers carrying that thing around for 17 years. He wants to help it, and also never touch it ever. You can almost see him thinking, "That was in my head?" And Dumbledore, instead of twinkly exposition, carries this heavy, quiet sorrow. He explains that this is what Voldemort has made of himself, that some injuries go beyond magic, beyond even this in-between place. And here's where the moral horror really kicks in. Nobody did this to Voldemort. He did it to himself, piece by piece, every time he chose power over people, immortality over integrity. Each Horcrux is basically a premeditated step toward becoming that thing under the bench. By the time we see it, there's a part of him that is literally beyond healing, destined for nothing but endless, helpless suffering. I mean, come on, that's darker than anything the Death Eaters pull on screen. Once you've seen that image, every Horcrux flashback gets retroactively worse. When HBO shows Tom Riddle charming Slughorn, stalking Hepzibah Smith, murdering for the diary or the ring, you're going to know exactly what he's carving himself into. Every casual Avada Kedavra is another slice off the soul, another layer of skin peeled away from that future creature. And in the next section, we're going to pull back even further and ask, if that's just one fragment, what does that say about the original Tom Riddle who started the cutting? So if that thing under the bench is just one slice of him, you might be asking yourself, what actually happens when the original finally runs out of pieces? What does it look like when the guy who spent decades trying to dodge death actually dies? In the book, it's almost disappointingly normal. Voldemort is hit by his own curse, his body arcs through the air, and he lands with what's described as a mundane thud. No storm, no screaming faces in green light, no soul shooting into the sky. His eyes are open and empty, and he looks, in case you've forgotten, like a man who has just died. That's the whole point. After 7 books of He Who Must Not Be Named, the text drags him back down to, this was just Tom Riddle with a nose job and a god complex. If you're like me, you watched the movie and went, wait, why is he flaking away like a cursed snowman in a wind tunnel? The films go for the big, satisfying CGI victory lap. Voldemort crumbles into ash, peels apart, and blows away over Hogwarts like evil confetti. It's visually cool, but it quietly lets him escape the one thing he fears most: being ordinary. HBO is probably going to swing the other way. Long, lingering shot. The echo of the spell dies. His body falls, hits stone, and just stays there. No music swell, no magical dust, just a corpse that used to be a legend. To make that land, the series has to earn it. We're going to see the last Horcrux go, maybe cross-cut between Nagini's death and that shriveled soul thing in King's Cross, twitching like it knows the safety nets are gone. His spells start misfiring, the Elder Wand keeps refusing him, and you can literally show that resistance, sparks sputtering, curses veering off, his hand shaking as he realizes the wand is choosing its true master right in front of everyone. I mean, come on, imagine the close-up on his face in that final second, the expression caught between rage, shock, and this tiny, pathetic flicker of, this can't be happening to me. And the awful part is, death isn't even a clean exit for him. His soul is already shredded into museum exhibit pieces. Whatever waits on the other side, he's not arriving as a whole person. No peaceful passing. No moving on. Just scattered remnants of Tom Riddle that can't be put back together again. Like a puzzle missing half the pieces, and some of them were stabbed. You don't have to take my word for it. That thing Harry sees in King's Cross is basically a preview of Voldemort's afterlife customer service experience. That's why the quiet, almost anticlimactic fall might be the scariest option. No fireworks, just the realization that every grand speech, every murder, every Horcrux ritual boiled down to a small man dying on a school floor. And the real horror. HBO can then ask, if that's what happens to him, what does it say about everyone else who played along with his nightmare? And once you ask what it says about everyone who played along, your brain kind of can't help doing the HBO thing and going, okay, so where's their show? Because if you're like me, you don't just want Voldemort. You want the whole ecosystem of awful that produced him, enabled him, and then had to live with the hangover. So, picture this, a Gaunt family miniseries. Not cozy cottagecore, more the house at the end of the lane your parents told you not to look at. We're going to sit in that shack, in the dirt, with an inbred line of Salazar Slytherin's descendants who have literally nothing left but blood purity and broken heirlooms. 1 season, 6 episodes, everyone a little gothic tragedy. You watch Marvolo rant about greatness while he can't even fix the roof, Morphin drifting in and out of reality, and Meropa quietly fading into the background until she makes the one choice that changes everything. Drugging Tom Riddle Sr. with a love potion. You might be asking yourself, how is that not just misery porn? Easy. You frame it like a cursed family saga. Each episode opens with that ring, that locket, that shack, and you see the curse of obsession passed down like a hereditary disease. The finale isn't a big battle. It's Merope alone in London, pregnant, out of magic, deciding to stop dosing Tom and just seeing what happens. Spoiler. What happens is Voldemort, born in a Muggle orphanage while the nurses gossip about how the mother didn't really try. I mean, come on, that's already more horrifying than half the jump scares in the films. Then you spin the camera forward into a First Wizarding War anthology. Every episode, different POV. 1 week, you're with a young Order member on a disastrous mission. The next, you're stuck in a small wizarding village where people keep disappearing and nobody wants to say the name behind it. Then you flip to a Death Eater who's just following orders, and a Muggle-born healer trying to patch up curses that don't have names yet. You don't have to take my word for it. The books quietly tell you this era was brutal. HBO could finally show the raids, the disappearances, the way people start checking over their shoulders just to buy groceries. Pattern interrupt. What happens after the war when the Dark Lord is gone and you still have to go to work on Monday? That's where the horror procedural lives. Post-Voldemort, post-Battle of Hogwarts, the castle's being rebuilt, and somewhere in the Ministry, a tired team of Aurors is tracking Death Eater remnants, processing war crimes, arguing about who gets Azkaban and who gets Imperiust off the hook. Imagine someone who fought in both wars, interviewing a teenager who joined at the last minute because their parents did. It's part cop show, part trauma clinic. Every case file is basically, so what did you do when the world went mad? And each of these could be its own dark lore to fall asleep to. Deep dive. 1 video just on the Gaunts' slow collapse, 1 on a single awful night in the First War, 1 on the ethics of post-war justice in a world where you can literally edit memories. In case you've forgotten, we've only skimmed the surface of how bad things could get. So which of these nightmares would you actually want to see first? The cursed family, the war anthology, or the exhausted Aurors picking through the rubble? And the wild part is, those were just the respectable nightmares. If you're like me, the real rabbit holes didn't even fit on the Iceberg graphic. They're kind of oozing off the bottom like cursed ink. So let me pitch you my new favorite horrors that I'm dying to turn into full episodes. First up, the Orphanage Files. We're going to need a whole video that never even leaves that grimy Muggle building. Picture it: peeling paint, bad porridge, and one eerily polite kid who keeps making other children do things they swear they didn't want to do. You might be asking yourself, how much can you really squeeze out of Tom Riddle grew up sad and lonely? I mean, come on, that's the Hallmark version. The books quietly give us thefts, cruelty to other kids, a secret hoard of trophies, and staff who clock that something is wrong, and then just file it under troubled but charming. I want to go incident by incident, build a psychological profile, and ask what was garden variety trauma and what was already Dark Lord brain showing through. I also really want to sit with the adults' blind spots. How many weird deaths, accidents, and missing items would it take before you stop calling Tom a funny boy? What would his school reports look like? Excellent marks, occasionally vanishes snakes. You don't have to take my word for it. The text basically begs us to read those scenes like a horror short story that never got expanded. Then, the Horcrux anthology. 1 episode per object. No exceptions. We start with the diary and end with Nagini, and for each one, we reconstruct the likely murder, the ritual, the immediate aftermath, and then the object's cursed little career floating around the wizarding world. Who did he kill for the ring? How did he pick the locket victim? What does the magic actually feel like when you rip your soul? I want to blend canon lines, interviews, and very careful speculation to turn each Horcrux into its own true crime case file. Imagine falling asleep, too. So, tonight, we're following a cup that sat in a vault for decades, quietly leaking madness. Cozy. Tied to all of that is the thing I'm calling Voldemort's inner mind. Level 8 barely scratched it. I want a full breakdown episode where we line up his quotes, his patterns, his weird hang-ups about names and death and blood, and compare him to real-world archetypes, cult leaders, serial manipulators, people who reinvent their identities until nothing's left. Where exactly does Tom end and Lord Voldemort begin? And does that line ever blur again when he's weak, or dying, or talking to Harry in the forest? So yeah, those are my new favorite rabbit holes. Which dark corner would you most like to fall asleep to next? The Orphanage Files, the Horcrux Casebook, or the Inner Mind Autopsy? Tell me in the comments so I know which nightmare to write first. So when you zoom back out from all those rabbit holes we just fell into, you start to see the shape of a very different Voldemort. We didn't just skim Snake Man bad and call it a night. We went from the movie version you grew up with, down through Tom's petty thefts and trophy hoarding at the orphanage, into the weirdly charming prefect at Hogwarts, then kept sinking through Horcrux rituals, proxy wars, occupations, and finally that pathetic, flayed soul thing whimpering in King's Cross. And an HBO version doesn't change him by slapping on darker lighting and a higher body count. That's the easy read. What really shifts is time. Time to sit with him in the orphanage long enough that you almost feel sorry for him, right up until he smiles while making another kid scream. Time to watch a whole season of Hogwarts where he's not the flashback. He's the main character, and you're stuck in his head as he decides, very calmly, that other people are just pieces. You might be asking yourself, isn't that already in the books? It is, but it's scattered. It's hinted. It's in half-remembered memories and second-hand stories. HBO is going to stitch that into lived-in reality. Instead of one moody flashback, you get a full orphanage episode. The matron trying to explain away the accidents. The other kids refusing to sleep near Tom's bed, the cupboard where he keeps his trophies. Instead of a quick diary info dump, you get a season-long Chamber of Secrets thriller where every Tom scene is a red flag you only recognize in hindsight. And when we hit the wars, it stops being a paragraph of exposition from Lupin and becomes an arc. Whole episodes of the First Wizarding War where you see how a Death Eater occupation actually works day to day. The curfews, the disappearances, the ministry memos that get a little more unhinged every week. If you're like me, you probably always wanted to know what "they tortured the Longbottoms into insanity" actually meant. HBO can show just enough of that to make you regret asking. The side effect of all this is that the wizarding world itself starts to feel way more complex and way more breakable. Tom stops being a meteor that crashes in from nowhere and becomes a product of the stuff we already knew was rotten. Blood purity, neglected children, a school that quietly rewards cruelty if it's ambitious enough. And at the same time, he's the catalyst that exposes every crack. House elf slavery, goblin resentment, centaurs refusing to help. Because once he pushes, everything fragile snaps. By the time you've walked through that whole iceberg, the movie Voldemort starts looking like the PG-13, streamlined adaptation of something way worse lurking in the text. I mean, come on. After you've watched a soul get peeled apart Horcrux by Horcrux, are you ever going to be scared of floating head in the back of Quirrell's turban? In quite the same way again? And the really fun question we haven't touched yet is, what does that do to Harry, and to you, when you try to sleep after watching it? So when you try to sleep after that, you're not just scared of a noseless snake man anymore, you're kind of bumping into the stuff underneath. Because once you slow Voldemort down from evil wizard speedrun to 10-episode character study, what keeps popping up? Fear of death, abuse and neglect, ideology as a fancy costume for cruelty, institutions that either look the other way or quietly fight back. You might be asking yourself, okay, but isn't that just every prestige drama ever? And yeah, in a way. The really unnerving part is that Voldemort only feels unique when we pretend he's a magical glitch in the system. When you actually look at the Gaunts, at the orphanage, at the way Hogwarts staff clock that Tom Riddle is off, and mostly file it under gifted but odd, he stops being a one-of-a-kind monster and starts looking like an exaggerated version of patterns we already know from history class and, you know, the news. Fear of death is the big obvious one. He literally tears his own soul apart because he cannot handle the idea of not existing. That's the cartoon version of something pretty normal. People wrecking other people's lives just to feel a tiny bit safer or more important. If you're like me, you read that as a kid and went, wow, dramatic. And then you hit adulthood and go, oh, that's just midlife crisis with extra murder. And the ideology piece? Blood purity, the old ways, all that. It's not subtle. But the scary part isn't the magic. It's how boringly familiar it is. A charismatic guy with a trauma history tells people they're better than their neighbors, blames an outgroup, and suddenly torture is necessary. Disappearances are regrettable, and the ministry is stamping paperwork for evil. You don't have to take my word for it. The books literally give you Fudge, Scrimgeour, Umbridge, and the quietly heroic civil servants trying to sandbag the flood from inside. What's wild is that all of this is smuggled into what is, on the surface, a children's fantasy series. You're reading about butterbeer and Quidditch and chocolate frog cards, and buried 2 chapters later is soul mutilation described in 1 paragraph and never really unpacked again. An HBO version is going to have a much harder time doing the fade to black, don't worry about it move. You show a Horcrux ritual on screen. You sit with it. You show the First Wizarding War as more than a montage. You can't gloss over the torture, the disappearances, the way neighbors start reporting on each other. That's the tension that keeps pulling people back as adults, right? The same world where you mentally go on cozy Hogsmeade dates also has an entire generation with PTSD and a school built on top of a battlefield. I mean, come on. It's literally a castle full of children where the solution to fascism is let the minors fight. That whiplash between comfort and horror is not a bug. It's the point. And sitting with that discomfort, letting it be your background noise while you fall asleep, is its own weird act of respect. It's choosing not to flatten this story into pure comfort food, not to pretend Voldemort is just a Halloween mask we outgrew. We're going to carry both things at once, the butterbeer and the body count. And once you accept that, the next question is what that does to Harry himself when the war is over, which is where we're headed next. And speaking of carrying both things at once, this is where I hand you the pensive. I want you to treat the comments like a big swirling stone bowl of memories and cursed what-ifs. So, first question. After all of this, which Voldemort actually scares you more? The theatrical movie villain with the dramatic cloak swish and the big snake nose, or the slow-burn HBO monster we've kind of stitched together from the books and lore tonight? You don't have to take my word for it that the book version is worse. I'm genuinely curious which one is going to be crawling into your brain at 3 a.m. And then, if you're like me, you probably already started mentally storyboarding an HBO season while I was talking. Which era would you most want to see get the full 10-episode treatment? Tom Riddle in the orphanage quietly terrorizing other kids and gaslighting the matron. Gaunt Shack flashbacks with blood purity rants and rings that are secretly Horcrux prototypes. The First Wizarding War as an actual war, with raids, disappearances, and Order members burning out one by one? Tell me where you'd park the camera. You might be asking yourself, okay, but which specific moment do I actually not want to see right before bed? So, pick your poison. Which Horcrux creation scene haunts you the most when you imagine HBO shooting it in loving, horrible detail? The diary tied to Myrtle's death in a bathroom echoing with her last scream? The ring in the Gaunt Shack, with Tom standing over his uncle's body like it's a science experiment? The cup in Hepzibah Smith's sitting room, tea set still rattling while she dies? Or are you saving all your dread for the night he makes Nagini into a living Horcrux? And while we're in the pensive, let's poke the biggest sore spot. Do you think Tom Riddle could ever actually have turned out differently? Or was the combination of Gaunt genetics, orphanage trauma, and pure ego always going to end in Snake Man fascist? I mean, come on, was there a universe where Dumbledore gets him into therapy and he becomes, like, a mildly annoying ministry official instead? I also want some friendly chaos in here. Should an HBO show fully lean into the Nagini retcon from Fantastic Beasts, or should that stay politely off-screen so we don't have to relitigate it every episode? How graphic do you want the war to be before it stops being darkly compelling and just turns into misery tourism? Where do you draw the line between a faithful adaptation of what's implied in the books and pure horror embellishment for shock value? Pour all of that into the comments. Memories, theories, nightmares, your cursed casting ideas, whatever. I'm going to be mining the best takes for future videos, so if you accidentally pitch the perfect Season 2 cold open, don't be surprised when it shows up in the next layer of this dark lore project. And if you've made it this far, calmly nodding along to, yes, actually, televised fascism and ritual soul mutilation would be great bedtime audio. I don't know where you've been hiding, but you are very much my people. So if you're like me, and your idea of winding down is listening to ethically questionable wizards make terrible life choices, the natural next step after Voldemort is to go sideways into Dumbledore or Snape. I've got a full Dumbledore iceberg, where we're going to pick apart every time he weaponizes a twinkle, manipulates children, and kind of treats free will as an optional side quest. Or if you want to stay in the morally gray sad man lane, cue up the Snape iceberg and let the was he a hero, a creep, or both debate lull you gently into unconsciousness. And maybe you're sitting there thinking, you might be asking yourself, okay, but what if I just want government corruption ASMR? Don't worry, the Ministry of Magic Deep Dive has you covered. That one is literally 2 hours of me whisper yelling about secret prisons, show trials, and how many people had to sign off on Dementors as a staffing choice. It's perfect background noise if you like to fall asleep to the sound of institutional failure. In case you've forgotten, all of these are tucked into playlists, so you don't have to go hunting through the channel at 3 in the morning with one eye open. There's a Dark Wizarding World Lore playlist that strings together the long-form stuff like this: icebergs, character dissections, ministry corruption, cursed magical creatures. Hit play once and you can pretty much let it run while you drift off. Wake up, question your life choices, and then drift off again while I'm still talking about soul metaphysics. If you want more of this on tap, you can subscribe or follow or whatever button your device gives you. Think of it as joining a very low-commitment cult, where the only initiation ritual is relaxing to war crimes analysis and arguments about whether mandrakes should have legal rights. No robes, no chanting, just you, me, and way too many opinions about Horcrux mechanics. And for anyone new who just stumbled in because HBO Voldemort sounded spicy, future videos are going to keep this exact mix: heavy research, dark humor, and a pacing level that's energetic enough to be interesting, but calm enough that you can still fall asleep halfway through a rant about basilisk breeding laws. You don't have to take my word for it. The older icebergs are all in the same style, so you can test drive them as background noise. I'll leave you with this. If Voldemort is us zooming in on the monster, the next big project is going to zoom out. Same world, earlier timeline, way more systemic horror. Let's just say we're heading into an era where wands were technically legal, but what people did with them should probably not have been. So let's pull the camera all the way back one last time. We've been zooming in on the monster for a couple of hours. Now I want you to see the whole iceberg we've been drifting past in the dark. Up at the tip, in case you've forgotten, is that skinny kid in the gray orphanage ward. Tom Riddle, lining up his possessions in a drawer, talking in that weirdly formal way, already collecting secrets like other kids collect chocolate frog cards. And way, way down at the bottom, in that whiteout King's Cross limbo, you've got the flayed, gasping soul thing under the bench, the part of him that can't be helped, can't be touched, can't even be looked at for very long without you feeling kind of sick. Top of the iceberg, bottom of the iceberg. Everything we've talked about tonight is the jagged stuff in between. If you're like me, you might be asking yourself how we got from one to the other in what is, on paper, a children's series. It's a straight line when you flatten it out. Lonely boy in a muggle orphanage, charming student collecting trophies and teachers, heir of a rotten bloodline playing at being a prince in the ruins, soul splitter experimenting on his own humanity, warlord turning ideology into body counts, disembodied parasite stuck on the back of a guy's head, resurrected snake man who has literally edited his own face, and finally that broken scrap of soul wheezing under the station bench like a dying idea. And wrapped around all of that is a name. Tom Marvolo Riddle, rearranged into Lord Voldemort because he hated the Muggle syllables that told the truth about him. He literally branded himself with an anagram and an accent. Over time, the world did the rest. People stopped saying it, not because the letters were magic, but because the story attached to those letters was. You don't have to take my word for it. Every terrified you-know-who is a tiny piece of free marketing for the Dark Lord. The funny thing is, the minute you walk all the way down the iceberg, the name gets smaller. Not less awful, but less mythic. When you know about the Gaunt Shack and the Orphanage, and the Horcrux rituals, and the way his voice changes every time he sheds another piece of himself, Voldemort stops being a jump scare and starts being a case study. By understanding the whole arc, we're going to steal back a little of that power he built out of mystery and silence. So whether you're somehow still awake, or you drifted off an hour ago and your subconscious is just freebasing dark marks right now, thank you for coming all the way down here with me. I know this was long and dense and full of pretty messed up stuff, but you stayed in the boat. And somewhere out there, in the dustiest corner of the Hogwarts library, or in a stressed-out HBO writer's room with too much coffee and not enough sunlight, there are still darker stories waiting just under the surface. Mandrakes that remember being babies, wars we only heard about in whispers, prophecies that never made it onto a page. I mean, come on, you didn't think this was the bottom of the iceberg, did you?